Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we journey not into a dreamscape, but into the gilded corridors of a kingdom built on whispers and silk, where power once wore a crown too heavy for the boy beneath it. This isn't the story of a fairy tale prince, it's the beginning of a slow unraveling, one that starts with cheers and coronations and ends in silence. And once we enter this tale, you might find it's harder to step back out, because what starts as promise soon becomes peril. And what is lost cannot be unlost. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I'm doing here. And please share in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. It's always fascinating to see how far this little nighttime caravan reaches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's begin tonight's journey together. His name was Armand VI, and he wasn't supposed to be king, at least not this early. He was 11 years old, with a serious stare and a taste for pageantry, when the crown of Florence was placed upon his small head in the year 1380. They say the room was filled with hope that day. Courtiers whispered of a golden age. The boy had charm, poise, a smile that made noble women blush and noblemen invest. They called him Armand the Beloved, and for a while, it stuck. In those early years, the kingdom sparkled. There were banquets so extravagant that people would talk about them for months. Armand loved the drama, the dances, the carefully choreographed parades. His court became a place of laughter, chivalry, and music that echoed through marble halls. Children were named after him. Coins were stamped with his face. No one could have guessed what was coming. But as every storyteller knows, light only matters when the dark arrives. The year was 1393. Winter gripped the city in its frost-bitten hand, and to chase the chill away, the court decided to throw a masquerade ball. But not just any masquerade, a performance, a spectacle. The theme? The wild men of the woods. Why not, right? The king and his entourage took the theme to heart. They dressed in linen suits soaked in resin and wax. Flax was added to the surface, giving them a hairy, savage appearance. They looked like creatures summoned from an ancient forest dream. Armand himself laughed as he took the floor, moving to the beat of drums while his costume crackled slightly under the torchlight. It was supposed to be thrilling, mysterious, unforgettable, and it was. Because one of the guests, the king's brother Leon, perhaps a little too enthusiastic, perhaps a little too drunk, wandered too close with a torch. And the moment the flame met the wax, everything turned. The costumes ignited like dry leaves. There was no time for screaming etiquette. Panic shattered the ballroom. Some men ran, only to set fire to others. One noblewoman threw herself over the king, smothering his costume with layers of velvet in desperation. Her name was Vernelle, Duchess of Berry, and she saved Armand's life. But she couldn't save the others. 4 noblemen, men who had laughed beside Armand just moments earlier, were consumed by the flames. They died slowly, over days, in agony that crept like smoke into every corridor of the palace. Armand lived, his skin unburnt. But something else caught fire that night, and it never went out. At first, it was whispered, a strange look in the king's eyes, a vacant stare, a stammer where once there was song. His physicians blamed stress, his advisors blamed spirits. But the truth sat quietly behind his ribs and began to spread. He forgot names, not just distant ones, but familiar, intimate ones. He'd walk the halls barefoot, convinced he was made of glass. He'd cry if anyone touched him too hard. Sometimes he'd forget who he was entirely, insisting he was St. Gareth come again, and demanded the royal crest be changed to match the new heavenly brand. And then there were the silences, days where the king wouldn't bathe, wouldn't change. His once shimmering robes became a nest of filth, his hair tangled, his nails clawed. Servants didn't know whether to approach him with water or prayer, but what terrified them wasn't the madness, it was the clarity between storms. Because in his lucid moments, Armand knew something was wrong. He'd look at his reflection with sorrow, apologize for his behavior, even ask if the dead still visited the ballroom at night. His sorrow was unbearable, because it was real, and it didn't last. Those moments of peace grew fewer and fewer. And as Armand fell deeper into the abyss, the kingdom began to fracture. Florence was built on confidence, a belief in its king, in its court, in its divine right to exist. But when your king howls at the moon and hides from sunlight under a table, confidence becomes a scarce commodity. The power vacuum didn't wait long. Noble houses moved in, factions formed like cracks in old stone, cousins whispered of legitimacy, uncles began collecting armies. One ambitious cousin even tried renaming the kingdom entirely after himself. And then, as if summoned by weakness, Albion, the old rival across the strait, saw their chance. Skirmishes became battles, trade routes snapped like old ropes. People stopped calling Armand the beloved. They started calling him something else, but not to his face. Never to his face. Through all this, Armand existed somewhere in between. Some days he held council, signed decrees, touched the world gently like a man checking if he was still dreaming. Other days he'd throw his chamber pot at the wall and sob for an hour because the sun looked too loud. He was a king in name, a myth in motion, a flickering candle in a drafty hall. And the saddest part, he still remembered what it meant to be loved. There's a story, one of the last lucid days he had. A knight, old and weary, arrived at court. He hadn't seen Armand in years. When the king spotted him, he paused. "What brings you here, old friend?" The knight knelt, his voice cracked. "To see you, my king. It has been too long." And Armand wept, not like a madman, not like a ruler, but like a boy who remembered what home used to feel like. He held the knight's hand and whispered, "Then stay. Stay with me. You are welcome here." For a moment, just a moment, the boy king returned, but like all ghosts in grand castles, he didn't linger. That was the beginning. There are 24 more parts to go, but not until you say the word. Just let me know when to continue. Armand's story might have ended in the shadowy corridors of his own mind, but the kingdom still had years to endure him, and he, in turn, had years to endure himself. His descent wasn't a plummet. It was slower than that, like a tapestry unraveling one golden thread at a time until all that remained was dust and regret. The palace tried to adjust. Rituals changed. Announcements were whispered instead of declared. His presence became unpredictable, his absence more frequent. Ministers debated whether to inform the public, but it's hard to hide a king who thinks he's invisible and keeps sprinting barefoot through the gardens yelling at ghosts. Sometimes he would disappear for hours, later found crouched behind a column, weeping and holding a spoon like a sword. On other days, he would sit motionless on the throne for so long that servants placed fruit beside him just to check if he was alive. His appearance, too, changed. The robes of state, once rich and ceremonial, now hung in tatters. His crown was rarely seen. Instead, he wore whatever garment happened to be near when he woke. One week, he insisted on a red cloak he believed could control the weather. Another week, he refused to wear anything at all, claiming his skin was royal enough. Attempts were made to manage him. Physicians, holy men, even a wandering mystic who charged a small fortune to realign the king's emotional humors. Nothing worked. Armand either ignored them or threw things. Once, he hurled an entire roast goose at Great Hall during a session of Parliament. No one mentioned it again. Still, not all moments were absurd. Some were unbearably quiet. During one particularly cold winter, he stood at a window for 6 hours, watching snow fall in silence. When a servant approached to guide him away, he whispered, "They're burying me, aren't they? Flake by flake." It was hard to say whether anyone feared or pitied him more. The court learned to tread lightly. Advisors became translators of nonsense, spinning his fragmented mutterings into political strategies. When he ordered the royal armory to be converted into a bird sanctuary for the angels who sing in my teeth, someone drafted a budget and hired a gardener. And while the palace found ways to cope, the rest of Florence was less fortunate. The power vacuum opened wider. With the king mentally absent, a new kind of war began, a war of whispers. Nobles turned on each other, alliances frayed like old rope, and distant relatives who had never seen Armand in person suddenly felt they were next in line to the throne. The royal council fractured into factions. Each claimed to be preserving the realm while privately fencing off chunks of it for themselves. Some used the king's madness as proof of divine displeasure, others used it as proof of divine favor, as if chaos itself were a form of prophecy. Amid this political scavenging, another threat rose: Albion. Their ships were seen again on the horizon, sails full and hungry. Their king, a man more shark than sovereign, saw Florence's confusion as a banquet. He began with border raids, testing the waters. By the time the Florentian council could organize a response, it was already too late. Villages burned, outposts fell. Trade routes collapsed under the weight of armed riders and bureaucratic delay. And back in the capital, Armand was found playing chess with a stuffed rabbit, unaware that half his kingdom was being eaten alive. In a cruel twist of irony, it was during these bleak years that Armand's rare moments of lucidity became most tragic. Occasionally he'd emerge from the fog, soft-spoken, disoriented, but undeniably himself, and he'd ask questions. Why are there guards at every door? Have the roses not bloomed this year? Where is my sister? She always sang when it rained. No one had the heart to answer. His sister had died 5 years earlier. The roses hadn't bloomed because the palace gardener had been conscripted. The guards, well, everyone knew why they were there. Worse still were the days when he remembered what he had forgotten. Once, after weeks of silence, he called for the royal scribes. When they arrived, he spoke with clarity. "I was a king once, wasn't I?" "Yes, your majesty. You still are." "No," he said quietly. "That boy is gone. The one who laughed, the one who danced. He burned, didn't he?" The scribes didn't answer. They just nodded and wrote nothing. As the years passed, Armand's moments of clarity grew further apart, like stars fading from the sky. Eventually, he stopped asking questions, stopped speaking entirely. He'd sit for hours staring at his own hands as if trying to remember what they were for. Toward the end, he became like furniture, moved from room to room, fed by servants, his body thin and bent like a forgotten reed. Occasionally, he'd mutter to himself in broken verse, songs from his childhood, lines of poetry, the names of people long buried. But the kingdom still had need of a king, even if only for ceremonial purposes. They dressed him up when required, sat him on the throne like a silent mannequin. He didn't blink when nobles swore oaths before him. He didn't notice when documents were signed in his name. He became a symbol, not of leadership, but of fragility. A living reminder of how easily greatness can fall apart. And then, quietly, in the spring of 1422, Armand's body gave up what his mind had abandoned long before. He died of dysentery in a private chamber, attended by 2 servants who didn't recognize the boy king in the frail figure beneath the sheets. There was no grand funeral, no parades. The kingdom was too busy bleeding to mourn properly. His death was a formality. His son, already acting as regent for years, stepped in without ceremony. And just like that, Armand VI, the beloved, the broken, the mad, passed from throne to memory, but the damage he left behind, that stayed. Florence remained fractured, distrust ran deep, the war with Albion raged on, and in the quiet corners of taverns and temples, people still spoke of him, not as a king, but as a caution. Because power without mind is a storm with no direction, and in Armand, the storm had raged long after the skies cleared. This was the legacy of a boy who never truly grew up, a king who ruled in pieces. And across the sea, another boy king waited. His name was Henry. Across the sea, far from the crumbling court of Florence, another throne sat waiting for a crown that would be far too heavy. This time, it wasn't a boy stepping into power. It was a baby, barely 9 months old, when the crown of Albion was placed over his crib. His name was Henry VI. If Armand had descended slowly, Henry never quite rose at all. His reign began not with a proclamation, but with a lullaby. His first royal act was drooling on a ceremonial sash, and while the nobles smiled at the charming infant with his pale cheeks and soft eyes, what they really saw was opportunity. Because a kingdom ruled by a baby isn't really ruled at all. Henry's uncles, cousins, and a suspiciously large number of close family friends gathered like moths to a candle made of gold. They claimed to protect him. What they protected in truth were their ambitions. The court was filled with soft footsteps, hushed arguments, and scrolls that no one dared read aloud. Regents were appointed, then replaced. Allies were made, then betrayed. The boy king became a prize to be won, not a person to be raised. As Henry grew older, he grew quieter. While other boys learned to spar, Henry preferred scripture. While they chased dogs through gardens, he sat indoors reciting psalms. He didn't want to command, he wanted to pray. He had no taste for battles, no ear for politics, and no appetite for ambition. In short, he was not made for the crown he wore. But the crown didn't care. Albion was a nation teetering between greatness and collapse. Its nobles were proud, its enemies restless, and its treasury noticeably emptier than it had been last decade. What the kingdom needed was a hammer. What it got was a candle. By the time Henry reached adulthood, his realm was already boiling. Factions had formed while he was still cutting his first teeth. Now they waited, swords drawn behind silk curtains, eager to see which way their gentle king would lean. He didn't lean. He hesitated. And hesitation in a court filled with men trained to pounce is blood in the water. At first, they mocked him quietly. The king who read, the silent saint. His own nobles would test him, bringing petty disputes before him and watching him fumble, hoping to find which ear bent more easily. He bent them all. If two sides asked for support, he gave it to both. If they asked for judgment, he postponed it. If they asked for leadership, well, they waited a long time. But still, there was a kindness to him. He walked among the poor, he funded schools, he founded Eton College and King's College, places of learning and quiet thought. He prayed constantly, gave generously, and ruled like a monk forced into royal robes. And then, in the summer of 1453, something broke. No one saw it happen. One morning, the king simply didn't respond. He was sitting in his chambers, a quill in his hand, a scroll half unrolled before him. A scribe knocked softly on the door, then entered, and found Henry staring straight ahead, unmoving. He didn't blink. He didn't speak. He didn't even flinch when a candle tipped over, spilling wax onto his lap. Physicians were called, priests too. They debated whether it was a curse or an illness, but no one had answers. Henry didn't sleep, didn't eat, didn't acknowledge his newborn son, his first and only heir born days earlier. Albion had no king, just a pale, unblinking shadow of one. The realm panicked. Without Henry, the war between the Langstons and the Yorkish, two branches of the royal bloodline, erupted like fire through dry wood. Years of tension snapped, swords clanged, banners rose. The War of the Roses had begun. And Henry? He sat. For over a year, the king remained absent from himself. His body was carried like furniture from room to room. His robes were changed, his beard was trimmed. But inside that skull, nothing stirred. When he did finally wake, if that's what it could be called, it was into a world already spiraling. The Yorkish had seized control. Their leader Richard had declared himself Lord Protector. His banners flew over the capital, and Henry, frail, confused Henry, was paraded through court like a ghost in a crown. He tried to speak, tried to command, but every sentence tripped over itself. His voice cracked, his orders contradicted. No one listened. His queen, Margaret, now fought harder than he did. She gave speeches, she rallied troops, she issued decrees in his name, all while Henry stood beside her, blinking slowly like a man still waking from a terrible dream. As battles raged, Henry drifted again, sometimes lucid, sometimes lost. Once he spent a week convinced he was a fisherman. Another time, he refused to wear anything but his baptismal gown. He would smile at people he didn't recognize and cry for people who weren't there. He had to be fed, dressed, led from room to room like a child. And the war didn't pause for him. It pulsed around him, fed by every moment of silence, every glance that didn't land. When Henry vanished back into himself, armies marched. When he returned, he was always too late. Captured, freed, recaptured. Passed like a relic between sides that only needed his name to justify their bloodshed. The people stopped expecting leadership. They started looking elsewhere. And when the Yorkish returned in 1470 and declared victory, no one was surprised. Henry, now barely alive in mind or spirit, was locked in the Tower of Albion. His queen fled. His allies were scattered. And he sat again, staring at nothing, unmoved by news of his son's death on the battlefield. A few days later, Henry himself was gone. No grand trial, no heroic final words, just a lifeless body in a cold stone room. The official story said he died of sorrow. The unofficial one whispered of murder. Either way, the result was the same. Albion had lost its king, twice. First to illness, then to silence. Henry VI, the gentle, the absent, the unready, had become not a ruler, but a ruin. And so, across two kingdoms, two kings fell. Not by sword, but by something more haunting. Their minds. North of Albion, across chill fjords and forests dense as secrets, a different kind of king once reigned. His name was Eric. His kingdom was cold, his crown was iron, and his mind, well, that was still being negotiated. At first, Eric looked like the perfect package. Tall, charismatic, educated, he could quote ancient texts, ride a horse like it owed him money, and dazzle foreign courts with just the right amount of regal melancholy. When he inherited the throne of Nordmark in the 16th century, his subjects were cautiously optimistic. Some even whispered the old gods must have favored him. For a time, it seemed they were right. Eric reorganized the government, taxed the rich, and even declared the forest protected from reckless chopping. He introduced laws to standardize coinage and tried to root out corruption. He was, in short, a very modern kind of king. But Eric also had a hobby: paranoia. It started subtly. A servant was dismissed for coughing too often. A nobleman was banished for not bowing low enough. Eric insisted that court messengers use different routes every day to avoid predictable patterns, he said. His personal guard tripled, his windows were covered, his food was tasted. Twice. By the end of his third year on the throne, Eric had a secret list of people he believed wanted him dead. The list changed constantly but never got shorter. Some nights, he would burn it. Other nights, he'd read it aloud to his reflection and promise revenge. Despite this, Nordmark still functioned. The people still paid taxes, the snow still fell, the rivers still froze in winter and thawed in spring. Then came the letters. Eric became convinced that foreign powers, Albion, Florence, even Rome, were conspiring against him. He believed his own nobles were corresponding with enemies in code. So naturally, he ordered that all private letters be inspected. Personal journals were seized, poetry was banned for being too metaphorical. People started disappearing. It wasn't an official policy. No decrees were written. But if someone questioned the king too boldly or looked at him too long, they simply stopped showing up. At first, it was just courtiers. Then came the scholars, the clerks, the gardeners. By the end of his 5th year, Eric lived in a palace that echoed. Everyone left inside walked lightly, spoke softly, and made sure to compliment the king's hair, even on days when he wore a helmet indoors. And then came the portraits. Eric commissioned dozens, hundreds even, of paintings of himself. Not just the usual royal poses. There were paintings of him fighting dragons, taming lions, sitting on clouds while angels played lutes. One particularly ambitious piece showed him holding back the tides with a raised eyebrow. He hung them in every room. He gave them as diplomatic gifts. He even had a special room built just to house the soul-sized versions, floor-to-ceiling depictions of himself that glared down at visitors like disappointed ancestors. But even with all the adoration, real or painted, Eric trusted no one. He started recording conversations secretly. He created a royal cipher only he could decode. He banned mirrors from the palace for a year, claiming they whispered to his enemies at night. Still, he ruled. And that was the most dangerous part, because unlike Armand or Henry, Eric could still function. He could issue orders, lead armies, make policy. But all of it was driven by a mind slowly turning inward, twisting logic into loops so tight they strangled reason. One year, he ordered the arrest of several nobles who had served him loyally for decades. They were tried in secret courts, condemned by confessions that may have been whispered in dreams. Their executions were public. Eric attended every one. He didn't flinch. Eventually, the nobles had enough. Led by his own half-brother, they staged a quiet rebellion. Not a war, just a carefully planned intervention. Eric was invited to a hunting trip. He accepted. Midway through the second day, he was surrounded, disarmed, and told his reign was over. He didn't shout, he didn't beg, he just laughed. Laughed so hard the forest echoed. Then he whispered, "So, it was you all along." and that was the last thing he said for 3 days. Eric was imprisoned, not in a dungeon, but in a fortress overlooking a frozen bay. His rooms were warm, his meals were regular, he was treated as nobility, but the door was always locked. He paced constantly, he talked to birds, he wrote letters to people who had died years before. Sometimes he tore them up before finishing. Sometimes he addressed them to the future, and in one chilling instance he mailed a letter to himself. It simply read, "Don't forget." Despite everything, some still believed Eric might return. His supporters called him the True North. They painted secret symbols on trees. They held midnight gatherings. They said he saw threats because he could see deeper than others. But time passed, seasons changed. Eric grew thinner, quieter. He stopped pacing, stopped writing, spent his days staring out over the ice as if waiting for the world to crack open and reveal a reason. One winter morning, his guards entered and found him standing on the balcony in bare feet. The snow had piled around him. His eyes were closed, his arms were outstretched. He whispered, "The sky knows." And they collapsed. He collapsed. He didn't die that day, but something else did. From then on, Eric spoke only in riddles, refused food unless it was round, slept during the day, stood at night. His world had folded into symbols only he understood, or maybe not even him. Eventually, he was moved again to a more comfortable estate further inland. The rebellion had long since transitioned into a new monarchy. A cousin now ruled. The land was stable. No one feared Eric anymore. He was just a legend, a warning, a story told to young advisors about what happens when a mind holds too much power for too long. He died in his sleep years later. No one noticed until afternoon. His last painting, unfinished, sat on an easel in the corner. It showed a mountain with no summit, a crown floating above it, and a single figure climbing endlessly upward towards something that didn't exist. The signature was 3 simple lines, E-R-K. No flourish, no explanation, just a final echo from a mind once filled with kings, storms, and ghosts. You might think that after Armand, Henry, and Eric, the world would learn that rulers with fractured minds should be watched closely, maybe kept at a distance from sharp objects and even sharper crowns. But no. History, like a particularly stubborn mule, insists on repeating its missteps. Which brings us to the frozen court of the North Sea, to a king whose reign began with cheers and ended with the sound of a lock clicking shut. His name was Christian, and unlike our previous monarchs, Christian had a very specific kind of madness, one that dressed itself in protocol and powdered wigs. He was crowned in the 18th century, during a time when monarchs were expected to behave less like warlords and more like elegant chess pieces. Christian tried. He wore the right clothes, memorized the royal rituals, attended balls, and learned to waltz without stepping on too many feet. But behind his pale eyes, something flickered. In his youth, people called him odd, sensitive, artistic. He'd spend hours composing melancholic tunes on the harpsichord, then abruptly shout at the furniture for being out of alignment. He once fired an entire kitchen staff because the bread was emotionally dishonest. But kings have a way of making eccentricity look sophisticated. So Christian was indulged, nodded at, dismissed with polite smiles. The truth wouldn't bloom until later. It began innocently enough. Reforms. Christian, inspired by Enlightenment philosophers he barely understood, decided he would modernize the kingdom. He slashed tariffs, ended censorship, even proposed religious tolerance, which in his deeply Lutheran country was about as welcome as a snowball in a sauna. His advisors panicked. Nobles grumbled. But Christian beamed. "This is progress," he said, while wearing a nightgown to a council meeting. And for a while, progress happened. He appointed a new physician, a man named Johann, brilliant, ambitious, suspiciously persuasive. Some say Johann had more influence than the entire cabinet. Others whispered that he hypnotized Christian. The truth? Probably simpler. Johann listened, and to a king teetering on the edge, that was priceless. Together, they passed laws that shocked the court, abolished torture, granted rights to commoners, expanded education. It was a golden age on paper. But inside the palace, the cracks widened. Christian began talking to mirrors, not in passing, not in jest. Full conversations. He'd ask them for advice, apologize to them. Once, during a state banquet, he excused himself to go consult the Southern Mirror before approving the dessert. His handwriting changed. Once neat and precise, it became frantic, looping, often illegible. Letters he wrote to foreign monarchs had to be intercepted because they included lines like, "The moon advised me against war," and "I have buried my doubts in the garden." He became obsessed with hygiene, bathed 4 times a day, refused to touch door handles, ordered the royal stables relocated because the horses were staring. At court events, he would shout random words mid-conversation, "Clock tower, paprika, intestines," then continue speaking as if nothing had happened. The nobility grew nervous, but no one dared move, because Christian still had a crown, still signed decrees, still gave speeches, sometimes lucid, often not, and behind him, always, stood Johann. Some began to suspect that Johann was the true king, that he used Christian's madness as a curtain, operating behind it like a playwright with a broken marionette. They weren't wrong. Johann passed edicts in Christian's name, replaced ministers, redirected funds, all while the king composed lullabies for birds and insisted that his left shoe had political opinions. Eventually, the nobility decided they'd had enough reform, enough whispers, enough shoe politics. They struck quietly. One night, guards loyal to the old order entered the palace, found Christian pacing in circles and reciting recipes backward. He didn't resist. He didn't even notice. Johann, however, was arrested, his papers seized, his belongings burned. Officially, it was treason. Unofficially, it was a message. We're back in charge now. Christian was declared unfit to rule. He was moved to a different wing of the palace, larger than a prison, smaller than a throne room. The windows were locked, the mirrors removed. Servants were instructed not to respond when he asked them questions about time travel or sheep rebellion. Still, he lived in comfort. Food arrived on time, music played softly in the halls. He was, by all appearances, a man enjoying a long vacation in very elegant pajamas. But the madness didn't sleep. Some nights, he would rearrange all the furniture into complex spirals and declare them maps to the divine. Other nights, he'd write page after page of mathematical equations using jam and send them to the Academy of Sciences with the note, "Please consider these when rewriting gravity." He no longer recognized portraits of himself. He once introduced himself to a visiting diplomat as the ghost of the last king, here to observe continuity. And yet, despite it all, he never stopped smiling. Christian was not violent, not angry, just misplaced. A mind exiled from its own coordinates. Years passed. His son grew up and took the throne. The court moved on. Reforms were rolled back, then reintroduced, then debated by men who pretended they invented the ideas. Christian, meanwhile, continued his quiet orbit. He aged, slowly, gracefully, like a book that no one reads but refuses to fall apart. In his final days, he spoke less, slept more. One morning, he asked for a mirror. They brought him one, cautiously, held it at an angle. He stared for a long time, then said, "Ah, you've aged too." And those were the last words he ever spoke. He died in his sleep that night. No fanfare, no thunder, just the quiet exhale of a man who'd wandered too far inward to ever return. His legacy? A question mark. Some called him a lunatic, others a visionary. Most eventually called him neither, because history doesn't like confusion. It prefers heroes and villains, but Christian refused to be either. He was just a man, one who ruled, reformed, unraveled, and then was remembered in soft whispers and footnotes. The king who talked to mirrors, the king who once wore a nightgown to parliament, the king who smiled while the world blinked. By now, you'd be forgiven for assuming that the age of mad kings had run its course, that Europe, having cycled through enough delusion to fill a library's worth of medical journals, might finally crown someone who didn't believe birds were spies or that bread could commit treason. But history, ever generous with its sense of irony, had one more royal descent into chaos to share. This time, we find ourselves in the stormy heart of 18th century Albion. The throne, polished and passed down like an heirloom nobody really wanted, now belonged to a king named George. Not the first George, not the second, the third. George III. To the public, he was a diligent man, pious, principled, polite to a fault. He rose early, read constantly, and seemed determined to rule with reason in an age that preferred spectacle. No lavish mistresses, no extravagant foreign palaces, just George in his study trying his very best. And for a while, it worked. He was the picture of royal responsibility. Handwritten notes in the margins of government papers, frequent meetings with ministers, carefully considered decisions, the kind of king you could bring home to meet your parliament. But even the steadiest candle flickers when the wind picks up. The trouble began subtly. He'd repeat himself in meetings, once or twice, then more often. He began talking faster, as if thoughts were sprinting through his brain without pausing for breath. Ministers found themselves struggling to follow. One recalled sitting through a 4-hour monologue about barley. Then came the letters, pages and pages of them, scrawled at all hours, addressed to friends, enemies, sometimes to no one. The handwriting, once precise, now meandered like a river that had forgotten its course. Sentences looped back on themselves, topics dissolved mid-thought. One entire letter was a detailed argument between two pieces of royal furniture. At court, whispers began. The king was tired, overworked. Maybe he needed a holiday. So they sent him away, to the country. Fresh air, fresh sheep, fewer government scrolls to talk to. But the fresh air didn't help. George returned more agitated than ever. He paced constantly, talked to portraits, refused to wear anything but purple for 3 weeks straight because, as he explained, it's the color of loyalty and I no longer trust the red curtains. Then the episodes turned physical. He would shake, sweat, shout at walls. Servants found him at dawn, barefoot in the courtyard, arguing with the moon. He claimed to hear music in his teeth. On one particularly eventful afternoon, he insisted he could smell treason dripping from the ceilings. And yet, between episodes, George could be painfully lucid. He'd apologize, weep quietly, beg not to be left alone. Those moments, brief, heartbreaking, human, made the madness harder to accept. Because it wasn't constant, it wasn't predictable. It came and went like a cruel tide, erasing parts of him while leaving others exposed. Doctors were called, many doctors. They tried everything the 18th century had to offer, which, to be clear, was mostly bad ideas soaked in mercury. They bled him, starved him, applied poultices of questionable origin to his chest while chanting about bodily humors. One physician insisted George was possessed by blue vapors. Another tried to reset his humors by dunking him in cold water repeatedly. No one asked George what he thought. They strapped him to chairs, forced tonics between his teeth, told the court he was improving while wiping his drool from their sleeves. Outside the palace, the nation held its breath. George was the king, the face on the coin, the voice behind every law. If he fell, what came next? The ministers debated quietly. Letters were exchanged, and eventually a decision was made, a regency. His son, also named George because originality had long since left the building, would act as Prince Regent, rule in his father's name, smile for the crowds, try not to start wars with France out of boredom. The elder George remained king in title, but he no longer held the reins. He spent his days walking the palace grounds under supervision, his nights muttering to the fire. Once he claimed to see angels in the wallpaper. Another time, he screamed for hours because he believed a servant had stolen his voice. But occasionally, just occasionally, the old king would surface. He would remember a date, a law, a face. He would ask softly if the people still remembered him. Then the mist would return, and he'd be gone again. Over the years, George faded. Not all at once, more like a painting left in the sun, colors dulling, edges blurring. He lost track of time, forgot names, spoke less and less. Eventually, he went blind. In his final years, he lived in Windsor Castle, silent, blind, lost in a world that no longer knew how to reach him. He died in 1820. No drama, no thunder, just silence, the same kind he'd lived in for years. And yet, despite it all, George III left behind a complicated legacy. He had ruled during war, through revolution, while losing entire colonies, while losing his own mind. And through it all, he had tried. Desperately, exhaustedly, often unsuccessfully, but tried nonetheless. History, as it always does, gave him a label: mad. It's neat, convenient. But like every king we've met tonight, the truth is messier. George wasn't a monster. He wasn't a tyrant. He wasn't even tragic in the classic sense. He was a man, a king who held too much for too long with too little help. A mind undone not by evil, but by being to carry the unbearable weight of an empire, alone. In the end, he remains a symbol, not of madness, but of the cost of silence, and the price of crowns that never come off, even when the mind beneath them begs to rest. If you're still here, still awake, still following the trail of broken crowns and unraveling minds, then you've probably noticed a theme. Royalty, for all its robes and rubies, has a tendency to chew up the human brain like a particularly ambitious goat. Which brings us now to the east, to the frostbitten grandeur of Imperial Russia, and to a czar whose story is less about mental collapse and more about never quite finding the rails to begin with. Enter Paul I, son of Catherine the Great. That alone should tell you everything you need to know. Because when your mother is one of the most powerful, strategic, and ruthlessly competent rulers in European history, well, the odds of you turning out emotionally balanced and creatively fulfilled aren't great. Paul was born into a crown-shaped shadow. His mother didn't trust him. She didn't raise him. She barely acknowledged him. Catherine preferred lovers, philosophers, and policies to parenting. Paul, meanwhile, was tucked away, raised by courtiers who were less interested in his development and more concerned with keeping him alive and just confused enough not to be threatening. He grew up in golden cages, watched constantly, groomed for a throne he was told he might never actually receive. Catherine was in no hurry to abdicate. Rumors swirled that she preferred the idea of passing the crown to Paul's son, her own grandson, instead. Paul, unsurprisingly, did not appreciate this. He became prickly, paranoid, obsessive, a man constantly measuring himself against a standard he wasn't even allowed to approach. When Catherine died in 1796, Paul didn't mourn. He seized power like a man reclaiming oxygen. Immediately, he ordered her body dug up and reburied with full honors next to his father, Peter III, a man Catherine had overthrown and possibly had murdered. It was Paul's first royal act. Symbolic. Petty. A bit morbid. But also classic Paul. Then came the changes. He reversed almost every one of Catherine's policies, dissolved her advisory councils, banned her favorite fashions, outlawed her political clubs. It was like watching someone tear down a palace just because the wallpaper reminded them of their mother. But Paul didn't stop at revenge. He wanted order. Absolute order. Military order. He restructured the court like a barracks. Everyone had to wear uniforms. Everyone had to march. Ministers were expected to salute. Noblemen were expected to shave. He personally inspected parades with the enthusiasm of a man who believed goose-stepping could cure betrayal. The nobility hated it. The soldiers hated it. Even the uniforms hated it, being redesigned so often that tailors began charging double for emotional damages. And Paul, he loved it. He believed that through structure he could purge chaos. Through obedience, he could banish the ghost of being unwanted. The empire, he declared, must reflect the will of one man, the emperor. Which is awkward when the emperor himself is increasingly unwell. Paul's paranoia bloomed like frostbite. He was convinced that everyone around him, advisors, servants, generals, possibly mirrors, were plotting against him. He banned the use of certain words in court documents. He forbade nobles from traveling abroad without written permission and 6 separate approvals. He once accused a child of espionage because linked too confidently. He built fortresses no one needed, stationed guards in places no one lived, reorganized the military so often that no one knew who outranked whom. Once, a colonel was arrested for obeying an outdated order Paul had personally issued 3 days earlier. His foreign policy was no better. Paul switched alliances faster than a bird dodging a cat. 1 week, he was fighting France. The next, he was allying with Napoleon. The week after that, he banned French books, French clothes, and French cheese, while simultaneously writing letters to Napoleon calling him "Dear Brother in Order." No one could keep up. Least of all Paul. He grew isolated, furious, exhausted by a world that wouldn't bend exactly the way he envisioned. His court began to resemble a theater production where the lead actor had rewritten the script every night and no one else got a copy. But perhaps the most telling sign came in his personal habits. He paced for hours in boots that squeaked. Servants learned to count his footsteps as a kind of weather forecast. 300 paces and the Tsar was anxious. 500 and someone was going to lose a title. He lectured paintings, told clocks to stop conspiring. Once tried to command the moon to lower itself because he was trying to sleep. People stopped laughing, stopped smiling, stopped breathing too loudly. The palace turned quiet, not out of respect, but fear. The kind that hums beneath chandeliers and tiptoes through velvet hallways. Eventually it became too much. Not for Paul. He was still issuing edicts about sock color and reconfiguring military ranks based on how pleasing the titles sounded, but for the people around him. In 1801, a group of nobles decided it was time. They didn't announce it, they didn't debate it, they just acted. One night, they entered his chambers, confronted the Tsar, and informed him that he was being removed. Not as a suggestion, not as a political formality, permanently. What happened next is still debated. Some say he resisted, some say he pleaded, some say he laughed and said, "I always knew it would be you." In the end, Paul died on the floor of his own palace, strangled with a sash, buried quickly, quietly, replaced by his son, Alexander, a man who would later face his own share of shadows, but that's a different bedtime story. Paul's reign lasted just 5 years, but those 5 years were enough to turn an empire upside down, inside out, and mildly paranoid about its own curtains. Today, he's remembered as the Mad Tsar. But like Armand, like Henry, like Eric, like George, he was something more fragile than madness. He was hurt, raised in a palace but denied a place, surrounded by power but starved of trust. And so when his turn came, he ruled not to lead, but to control, to fix a world that had never made space for him. And that, as always, ended badly, because power is a crown, but it's also a mirror. And the longer you stare into it alone, the more likely you are to see something staring back, something wearing your face and smiling too wide. By now, one might reasonably ask, was there ever a time when royalty didn't unravel like badly stitched curtains in a thunderstorm? Did any crown come without a side order of psychological turbulence? Or were thrones just cursed chairs with really good upholstery? Tonight, we travel to one of Europe's lesser-known kingdoms, smaller in map size, but impressively oversized in chaos, the Principality of Moravia-Leiden. And no, it wasn't fictional, just largely forgotten, like a drawer full of expired royal decrees and unwashed wigs. At the center of it all stood Leopold IV, a name that sounds trustworthy, sensible, and maybe even mildly charming. But names can lie, because Leopold, for all his polished manners and courtly smile, was about as stable as a ladder made of breadsticks. He was born into a family that had survived centuries of bad decisions. His great-grandfather had once tried to invade his own country by mistake. His father banned clocks for making time pass too quickly. So expectations for Leopold were, let's say, cautiously optimistic. At first, he seemed promising. He read Latin, spoke 6 languages, knew the names of all his dogs. He was crowned at 22 with a full head of curls, a pocket full of idealism, and a deeply misplaced belief that everyone at court had his best interests at heart. Spoiler, they didn't. Leopold wanted reform, modernization, clean streets, functioning trade, a legal system that didn't involve trial by interpretive dance, all admirable goals, but also deeply naive. He began by limiting noble privileges. Bad idea. Then taxed church land. Worse idea. Then replaced all ceremonial guards with more agile civilians, a phrase that here meant confused farmers in too tight uniforms. Within months, Moravia-Leiden's elite were sharpening their metaphorical knives, and a few very literal ones. They smiled at Leopold in court, toasted his health in public, and quietly planned his downfall at midnight suppers. Meanwhile, Leopold's behavior began to wobble. It started with noise. He became obsessed with it, insisted the palace was too loud even when no one was speaking, claimed the sound of silk brushing against marble gave him existential vertigo. He had all the rugs removed, then reinstalled, then set on fire because they whispered impure thoughts. Next came his diet. For 6 months, he ate only white food, boiled eggs, milk, turnips. When asked why, he replied, Color breeds deceit. Then there were the disguises. Leopold would sneak out at night dressed as a peasant to commune with the common soul. It might have worked, except he insisted on keeping his royal boots, which lit up in the moonlight like two gossiping chandeliers. He was recognized, every time. Still, he kept going. Once he returned at dawn, claiming he'd been blessed by the spirit of the gutter, and demanded a statue be erected to commemorate it. The statue was built. It resembled a puddle. By this point, the court was splitting into camps, the "he's just creative" faction and the "please hide the swords" coalition. Neither side won. Because Leopold had another idea. He wanted to abolish titles. Not reduce them. Abolish. No more dukes, he declared. Only dreamers. His official reasoning? Names trap the soul. His unofficial reasoning? Well, he also believed the moon was judging him, so clarity wasn't always available. The nobility, of course, panicked. Some fled, some plotted. One nobleman tried to pretend he was already a dreamer and arrived to Parliament wearing a nightcap and carrying a stuffed owl. Leopold promoted him to chief visionary of roadways. The roads did not improve, and through it all, Leopold's mood darkened. He became suspicious of windows, banned the color green, held long, rambling speeches to audiences that had long since lost the ability to blink. He wrote poetry, volumes of it, all about betrayal, fog, and one recurring character, the empty man in the hallway. He claimed the empty man followed him, that he moved only when Leopold wasn't looking, that he drank sounds. At one point, the king ordered his guards to arrest this hallway phantom. They arrested a mirror. It was trialed, sentenced, and ceremonially covered in black velvet. Yet still, no one could quite remove Leopold. He was still king, still signed laws, still occasionally lucid enough to veto things like legalizing indoor cat taxation or replacing currency with dried lentils. But the walls were closing in. Eventually, his own advisors staged an intervention. Not a coup, more of a strongly worded suggestion. They told Leopold the kingdom required a sabbatical of spirit, that he would be honored as a king in retreat, that he'd live in a beautiful estate surrounded by silence, solitude, and most importantly, locked doors. Leopold agreed, almost cheerfully, moved into a countryside manor, wrote daily letters to the empty man, none of which were mailed. He passed his days arranging pebbles into circles and composing operas for insects. Once staged a dramatic reading of a tree's autobiography, which he claimed was whispered to him by bark alone. The kingdom moved on. A cousin was crowned, laws were restored, roads were repaired by people with actual maps. And Moravia Leiden, for a brief moment, experienced something like normalcy. Leopold lived another 20 years, unbothered, unhurried, unquestioned. Some say he finally found peace. Others say he believed he was made of candle wax and refused to go near fireplaces. In the end, he died quietly, alone in a room filled with mirrors he had once buried under flower pots, claiming they were portals to too many selves. The final entry in his journal read, "I am not lost, I am just elsewhere. No crown, no rebellion, just the gentle echo of a man who spent his life trying to understand a world that never really explained itself." Leopold IV, king, poet, enemy of rugs. Another chapter in the ever-growing book of monarchs who ruled and unraveled with equal enthusiasm. There's something poetic about how madness chooses its royalty. It never strikes the lazy ones, the pampered playboys who spend their reigns bathing in rose water and inventing new ways to avoid taxes. No, madness waits for the dreamers, the idealists, the ones who think the world can be bent into something better if they just try hard enough. Which leads us to the final piece of this royal puzzle. Ludwig II of Bavaria, a king who didn't just fall into madness, he waltzed into it. When Ludwig took the throne in 1864, the world was already inching toward the kind of cold industrial pragmatism that crushes poetry under the weight of steel and timetables. The age of chivalry was over. Ludwig, unfortunately, didn't get the memo. He believed in beauty, in myth, in swans, in operas so long they required snacks at intermission and possibly a second life to fully understand. He was tall, handsome, brooding, basically a Disney prince who'd been left unattended near a philosophy shelf. He spoke softly, dressed dramatically, and regarded court protocol with the enthusiasm of a houseplant at a military parade. From the beginning, he ruled like someone auditioning for a different century. He rode alone through the Alps at midnight. He memorized passages from medieval romances. He composed letters so florid they made poets blush and postmen confused. He refused to marry, broke off engagements, wrote passionate letters to male friends that historians still try to translate with a straight face. But behind all this velvet melodrama was a man desperately trying to escape the one thing he couldn't outrun: reality. Bavaria at the time was no fairy tale. It was broke, politically fragile, and increasingly tangled in alliances that smelled suspiciously like Prussia. The ministers wanted budgets, war strategies, railway investments. Ludwig wanted castles, specifically his castles: Neuschwanstein, Linderhof, Herrenchiemsee. If you've ever seen a building and thought, that looks like someone gave a poet unlimited marble and said, go nuts, you've seen Ludwig's work. Turrets that touch the clouds, halls lined with gold, chandeliers the size of small boats, every room designed not for comfort but for feeling, for pretending, if only for a moment, that the world outside didn't exist. And in these castles, Ludwig did just that. He withdrew. He stopped attending meetings, stopped replying to letters, stopped acknowledging that time passed without his permission. He ate at odd hours, dined alone, left plates untouched because the moon wasn't in agreement. His servants were trained to never look him in the eye. He once fired an entire staff for arranging books in a way that displeased the wind. But while his imagination soared, Bavaria sank. The castles weren't just extravagant, they were financially catastrophic. Ludwig funded them with personal money, then borrowed against the crown, then borrowed against that, until the royal books looked less like accounting and more like a creative writing exercise titled How Not to Kingdom. His ministers begged him to stop. He refused. Instead, he doubled down, ordered a new fountain that played music, commissioned a ceiling that mimicked constellations using actual diamonds, requested a throne room built entirely from amber, then redesigned it because the amber wasn't glowing emotionally enough. Eventually, the cabinet panicked. This wasn't just eccentricity. This was a king whose grip on reality had slipped so far that even the swans were worried. So they did what ministers have always done when faced with a monarch who thinks cloud formations are personal messages. They declared him unfit to rule, quietly, legally, and with the help of a doctor who had never once examined Ludwig in person but wrote a diagnosis based on observed patterns, which in this case meant he keeps building palaces and talking to imaginary kings. On June 10th, 1886, Ludwig was arrested. No dramatic standoff, no thunderclap, just a quiet knock, some very polite officials, and the slow realization that his story was no longer his to write. He was taken to Berg Castle, a lovely estate that suddenly felt a lot like a cage. 2 days later, he went for a walk with the same doctor who had signed off on his removal. They never returned. Their bodies were found floating in the shallow waters of Lake Starnberg. No wounds, no struggle, just a dead king and a dead doctor, side by side in the still, cold water. Officially, it was ruled a drowning. Unofficially, well, theories still swirl. Some say Ludwig jumped. Some say the doctor tried to stop him. Others whisper darker things, of murder, of silencing, of a final royal punishment hidden behind the silence of ripples on a lake. But whatever the truth, it ended the same way. The Swan King was gone. Bavaria moved on. Castles were finished, some anyway. Bills were paid, ministers returned to their ledgers. And the dream, that beautiful and practical dream of a kingdom ruled by poetry and moonlight, faded into legend. Today, Ludwig is remembered less as a monarch, more as a myth. His castles are tourist destinations, his story, a cautionary tale with really good architecture. But behind the postcards and guided tours is a man who never truly fit the world he was given. He wasn't a tyrant, wasn't violent, wasn't even all that mad if we're being honest. He was sensitive, that fragile, inconvenient kind of human that doesn't do well with balance sheets and battlefield logistics. And maybe, just maybe, heck, he wasn't crazy at all. Maybe the world was. A world that couldn't make space for beauty unless it turned a profit. that mocked tenderness unless it marched in uniform, that labeled wonder as madness and built monuments only after the dreamer drowned. So tonight, as you drift to sleep, think of Ludwig, alone in his castle, writing letters to stars, designing palaces for no one, and whispering to himself that yes, the moon does understand, even when the ministers don't. So far, we've seen kings who talked to furniture, czars who feared moonlight, and emperors who believed their shoelaces were plotting coups. Which might leave you wondering, were queens somehow immune? Did royal madness only knock on doors with Y chromosomes and ceremonial swords? Absolutely not. Madness, as we've learned, is an equal opportunity guest, and tonight it arrives wearing pearls, lace, and the weight of an empire collapsing in slow motion. Welcome to the world of Empress Elizabeth of Austria, or as history knows her, Sisi. Now, Sisi wasn't born for the throne. She was a Bavarian duchess, a teenage horse girl with more interest in hiking boots than court protocol. At 15, she was dragged along to a marriage meeting for her sister, only for Emperor Franz Joseph to take one look at the shy, wide-eyed Sisi and say, "Actually, I'll have that one." Romantic? Sure. Also, mildly alarming. She was married at 16, crowned empress, moved into the Habsburg court, a glittering nightmare of rigid etiquette, political chess games, and enough repressed emotions to sink Venice. Sisi did not adjust well. She hated the court. She hated the rules. She especially hated her mother-in-law, who treated her like a defective decorative vase and immediately took control of raising Sisi's children. Within a year, the young empress was isolated, depressed, and constantly ill. The court diagnosed her with melancholy. A more accurate label might have been trapped. So like many people in too tight cages, Sisi began running. Literally. She rode horses for hours, hiked mountains at dawn, swam in icy lakes, anything to stay moving, because movement meant freedom, and freedom meant not thinking about the fact that she was technically one of the most powerful women in Europe, and also had less control over her life than the palace gardener. Then came the obsessions, with beauty, with thinness, with control. She weighed herself daily, maintained a waist so small corsets had to be custom engineered by people who probably went home and cried. Her daily routine involved cold baths, raw meat facials, and hair care rituals that lasted 3 hours. She often refused food, lived on milk and oranges, once fasted for a week because the wind was judgmental. She became a shadow, a beautiful, untouchable, almost mythical one. Paintings of her show an ethereal figure with waterfall hair and eyes full of oceans, but none of them show the woman refusing to speak at court dinners or leaving mid-conversation to avoid being infected by expectation. And while the empire crumbled around her, nationalism rising, revolutions brewing, Hungary sharpening its knives, Sisi focused on poetry. She wrote constantly about sorrow, about longing, about wanting to melt into the sky like mist and never be perceived again. She identified with Greek tragic heroines, especially the dead ones. At one point, she declared herself a soul misplaced in history. She wasn't wrong. By the time she hit 40, Sisi had almost completely abandoned her role as empress. She stopped appearing at court, refused public events, traveled obsessively, spent months on yachts, wandering the Mediterranean in silence while servants speculated about whether she was communing with sea spirits or just avoiding another state dinner. She learned languages no one asked her to learn, modern Greek, Hungarian, Arabic, because human connection was confusing, but syntax was safe. When her only son, Rudolf, died in what became one of the most scandalous murder-suicide incidents in royal history, Sisi didn't break. She evaporated. She wore black every day for the rest of her life, refused photographs, carried a folding screen with her in public to avoid being seen. People began calling her the Black Queen, others just called her a ghost. The empire tried to pull her back. It failed. Because how do you reclaim someone who's already halfway into myth? She continued drifting, through palaces, across borders, always one train ticket ahead of her past. When asked for interviews, she responded with silence. When offered security, she refused. She dismissed her guards, said protection was for people who expected to be missed. She was right. In 1898, While walking along the promenade in Geneva, alone, no entourage, no fanfare, she was approached by a man with a sharpened file. He stabbed her once in the chest. She barely reacted, thought it was nothing, continued walking. An hour later, she collapsed. The blade had pierced her heart. She died on a hotel couch, surrounded by strangers, her last words whispered in confusion. What happened? And just like that, Cece was gone. No final speech, no grand farewell. Just a woman who had spent her whole life running from walls that looked like marble but felt like cages. Today, Cece is remembered in fragments. Some see her as a fashion icon, others as a tragic beauty. There are musicals, statues, perfumes bearing her name, but most miss the truth. She was not mad in the way the others were. Not loud, not erratic. Her madness was quiet, refined, cultured, the kind that dresses itself in manners and poetry in long lonely walks at dusk. She didn't scream at furniture, she simply disappeared behind it. And in doing so, she left behind one of the clearest warnings history has to offer, that not all prisons are made of stone. Some are made of silk, of crowns, of expectations so heavy that even the strongest spine eventually folds. Cece bore it with grace, with elegance, with aching, deliberate silence, but it was still too much, because in the end, the empire didn't kill her, the blade did, but the weight, that came long before. At this point, you might be wondering, after centuries of mental spirals, courtly breakdowns, and delusions so extravagant they deserved their own orchestras, maybe, just maybe, the world learned a lesson. That absolute power plus absolute pressure equals royal psychodrama? You'd think. But history doesn't do closure. It prefers echoes. And tonight's echo comes from a surprisingly recent stage, the early 20th century. Right on the eve of modernity, in a world that had already discovered telephones, trains, and far too many guns for anyone's comfort. The curtain rises on King Otto of Bavaria. Yes, another Bavarian. Apparently, that scenic kingdom specialized in three things: mountains, castles, and hereditary nervous breakdowns. Otto was the nephew of Ludwig II, the same Ludwig who built fairy tale castles, talked to swans, and was ultimately dethroned for being a little too magical for accounting purposes. So the family mental health tree, already listing heavily to one side. When Ludwig was declared unfit, the crown passed not to a seasoned statesman or a stabilizing adult, but to Otto. And Otto, bless his soul, was already elsewhere. Not metaphorically, not spiritually, just not present in any way that a functioning monarchy typically requires. He had shown signs for years, withdrawn, nervous, uncommunicative. He feared strangers, avoided mirrors. Occasionally stood completely still for hours, staring at nothing in particular, like a human pause button. Doctors called it deep melancholia. Courtiers called it a logistical nightmare. But inheritance doesn't care about diagnosis. It only cares about bloodlines. And so in 1886, Otto became King of Bavaria. On paper. In person, he remained locked away in Fürstenried Palace, an elegant but heavily guarded villa on the outskirts of Munich, complete with high walls, silent halls, and medical staff who never spoke above a whisper. He was called His Majesty. He signed nothing, attended nothing, said almost nothing. Bavaria, meanwhile, carried on, because behind the scenes, Otto's uncle, Prince Luitpold, stepped in as regent. He ran the country, hosted the banquets, signed the laws, and waved at the parades. It was monarchy by proxy, an empire run by caretakers. And Otto? He was the ghost in the palace. He spent his days walking the same corridors, shuffling in soft slippers, occasionally muttering to paintings. Some said he believed he was still a child. Others said he feared his own reflection. He rarely saw visitors. When he did, he often didn't recognize them. Once, a minister brought him a bouquet of white roses. Otto stared at them, then whispered, "They're mourning me." He wasn't wrong, because even though he was technically king, even though coins bore his name and proclamations opened with royal praise, Otto was gone. Not dead, not buried, just misplaced. His reign lasted 27 years. Longer than some empires, but he never ruled, never led an army, never opened parliament, never gave a speech. He was a king in name only, a monarch whose throne existed entirely in legal documents and carefully worded press releases. And still, no one had the nerve to remove him, because doing so would mean admitting something terrible. that the crown was broken, that it had passed not to a flawed man or a strange one, but to someone who simply wasn't there. And so the court tiptoed. Doctors submitted quiet reports, newspapers practiced strategic silence, foreign dignitaries asked polite questions and got even politer lies. The people of Bavaria, for the most part, accepted it. They had food, roads, music, a regent who shook hands and avoided scandal. Why rock the boat even if the captain was asleep in the hold? But the world outside didn't wait. The 20th century rolled in like a hurricane in steel boots. Empires cracked, revolutions sparked, and Bavaria, once a sleepy kingdom of poets and paranoia, found itself in the middle of political earthquakes it couldn't ignore. In 1913, with the world on the brink of World War I, something finally snapped. Otto was officially deposed. Quietly, without ceremony. Just a document signed by the regent's son, now ready to become king himself. Otto didn't resist. He wasn't told. He was still pacing his corridors, still whispering to invisible guests, still believing that time had politely stopped in his honor. He died 3 years later in 1916. No state funeral, no grand farewell. Just a footnote in a war-torn chapter of European history. His palace, once echoing with royal silences, faded into a sanatorium, then a military hospital, then a place tourists pass by without noticing. And Otto? He became an anecdote, a quiz question, a reminder that sometimes royalty is just a title strapped to a soul who never wanted the weight. He left behind no laws, no wars, no scandals, just a question. What happens when a man is crowned but never consulted? When power is given without choice, when the crown doesn't crush a person but simply passes through them like smoke? For Otto, the answer was a life of silence, a throne without footprints, a reign that existed only because no one wanted to admit it shouldn't. And perhaps that's the saddest madness of all. Not the kind that rages or rants, but the kind that is simply absent, still breathing, still present, but already gone. If monarchy were a stage play, and let's be honest, it often is, then by now we've seen every genre imaginable. Tragedy, farce, absurdist improv with questionable costumes, but tonight's act feels different. It's not explosive, not theatrical. Instead, it's quiet, heavy, a kind of slow-burning madness that slips in between the crown jewels and the medical reports. Tonight, we meet Maria Eleonora of Brandenburg, Queen of Sweden, or more precisely, Queen Consort, royal wife, and soon to be the emotional equivalent of a storm cloud with excellent posture. She was born a princess, raised among polished halls and stiff etiquette, groomed for royal marriage, instructed on embroidery, piety, and how to smile with just the right amount of sorrow. Her childhood was structured like a menu, courses of obligation, side dishes of formality, and no room for second helpings of joy. She was married off to Gustavus Adolphus, the warrior king of Sweden, a man adored by his people, admired by generals, and frequently too busy conquering large chunks of Europe to actually spend time at home. Maria Eleonora, unsurprisingly, was not thrilled. Sweden, it turns out, was cold, literally and emotionally. The court was austere, Protestant, suspicious of anything too lavish or too cheerful. Maria, who had grown up surrounded by music, art, and delicately gilded ceilings, found herself trapped in a palace that felt more like a tax office with better curtains. Her marriage, though politically brilliant, was personally dismal. Gustavus was distant, busy, rarely there. And Maria? She grew brittle. She didn't adapt so much as retreat, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, into a shell lined with velvet grief and passive-aggressive embroidery. Then came the birth of her only child. A daughter, Christina. This was a problem. Maria had been desperate for a son. She wept when she saw the child, then insisted the baby be dressed in boys' clothes anyway, just to maintain hope. She wasn't subtle about her disappointment. She rarely held the child, barely spoke of her. Preferred to decorate the nursery with portraits of saints who had died dramatically. Christina, for her part, grew up precociously independent, possibly because she realized early on that no one else in the palace was particularly interested in parenting her. But the real fracture came in 1632. Gustavus died in battle. His body was returned home in a sealed coffin, and Maria Eleonora, she unraveled. Not in the operatic, throw yourself into a canal sense, more like a tapestry slowly pulled apart thread by thread over the course of several unblinking months. She demanded her husband's heart be removed and placed in a golden urn. It was. She then kept that urn in her bedroom, where she spoke to it, slept beside it, insisted the servants address it as His Majesty. She wore black, refused light, blocked the palace windows with thick curtains. One visitor described the royal chambers as permanently twilight, smelling faintly of salt and sorrow. She made her daughter sleep in the same room, with the urn and the heart and the darkness. Christina would later describe this as not ideal. Maria also refused to bury the rest of the king's body. She kept the coffin above ground, displayed in the castle, for over a year. Imagine visiting the palace for tea and being offered biscuits beside the former king's sealed casket. The atmosphere was what one might charitably call morbid chic. Servants tiptoed, advisors murmured, but no one dared confront her, because grief, when royal, becomes sacred, untouchable, even when it rots. Eventually, someone, likely multiple someones with very strong nerves, intervened. The king's body was finally buried. The curtains were opened. The urn, however, stayed. Maria retreated further. She wrote long, dramatic letters to friends who never replied, spoke in riddles, once attempted to train a canary to recite verses of grief. It failed. She blamed the light. Christina, meanwhile, was growing up into a strange, brilliant, sharp-tongued teenager with the energy of a firework that refused to go off. She read philosophy, argued with theologians, insisted on wearing men's clothing, and once declared, "I am not made for marriage, I am made for arguments." Maria Eleonora tried to exert control, failed, tried again, failed harder. Eventually, the court stepped in. They removed Christina from her mother's care. Quietly, legally. Maria was not informed. She discovered it when the guards stopped saluting her. She screamed, sobbed, then wrote a 42-page letter to a priest comparing herself to the Virgin Mary, the Tower of Babel, and a very specific kind of weeping willow. The next few years were a blur. She was exiled from court, sent to a quiet estate, given an allowance. No one spoke of the urn. There were rumors that she wandered the halls at night, muttering old royal commands, that she dressed her cat in Gustavus's medals, that she insisted her garden be arranged to spell Y when viewed from above. None confirmed. She died in 1655, quietly, alone, surrounded by faded tapestries, unopened letters, and a still-polished urn. History filed her away under melancholic, which is a polite way of saying a woman who lost everything and never learned how to pretend otherwise. But Maria Eleonora wasn't just mad. She was grief, weaponized. She was what happens when sorrow is given sounds, golden urns, and no exit. And in the end, she became her own monument. Not in marble, but in memory, a queen wrapped in black, whispering to a heart that had stopped listening. And now, we arrive at the final curtain, the last whisper of silk, the final flicker of candlelight in a room full of long-dead portraits. You've seen kings lose their minds to mirrors, queens swallowed by grief, and emperors reduced to whispers in padded rooms. But tonight we close the book with a ruler whose madness was not loud, not even dramatic, but systematic, efficient, industrial, and therefore all the more terrifying. Ladies and gentlemen, meet Friedrich Wilhelm I of Prussia, a king with no patience for lace, no interest in poetry, and absolutely no tolerance for anyone who didn't stand up straight and salute a button correctly. He wasn't born mad. He was born precise. From the beginning, Friedrich Wilhelm seemed slightly allergic to joy. While other royal children played, he inspected. While his cousins practiced minuets, he practiced marching in place until his legs hurt. He once scolded a footman for blinking out of rhythm. When he inherited the throne in 1713, the world expected royal splendor, balls, banquets, tapestries. Instead, he gave them gunpowder and potatoes. He slashed the royal budget, fired most of the palace staff, auctioned off the royal silver, then used the money to buy muskets and socks, because according to him, an army marches best when its feet are neither blistered nor drunk. He turned Prussia into a boot camp with borders. The entire court was reorganized as if someone had spilled a bottle of discipline across a map. Ministers had to appear in uniform. Nobles were required to serve in the army. Peasants were encouraged to farm efficiently or be beaten with a ruler. Not metaphorically, a literal ruler with inch markings. And it didn't stop there. Friedrich Wilhelm had a fascination, no, an obsession with tall soldiers. Specifically, extremely tall soldiers. He created an elite regiment of giants, handpicked, imported, bred in some cases. If you were over 6 feet and living anywhere in Europe, congratulations. Prussia wanted your DNA. He paid farmers to marry tall women. He sent agents to kidnap tall boys. He once tried to negotiate a political alliance based entirely on access to unusually large Irishmen. He called them his long fellows, dressed them in magnificent uniforms, had them march, parade, pose, but never fight. Oh no, these men were too precious, too tall to risk. They were human trophies, and he adored them. Sometimes he'd just sit and watch them silently, like a child with a life-sized action figure collection. At least once he made them sing to him while standing in order of height. And that was the soft part, because Friedrich Wilhelm was also violent, explosively, unpredictably, ferociously violent. He beat his servants, his generals, his own children, not with abstract disappointment, but with actual sticks, belts, and on one unforgettable occasion, a tax ledger. He once beat a page boy so thoroughly for misplacing a boot that the child forgot how to conjugate verbs for a week. His favorite son, Friedrich, the future Frederick the Great, was not spared. Friedrich, the son, was everything the father hated. Artistic, soft-spoken, fond of flutes and French philosophy. So naturally, his father tried to beat it out of him. When that didn't work, he tried threats, then prison. At one point, he had his son arrested for attempting to flee the country, made him watch as his best friend, his accomplice, was executed in front of him. Not quietly, not politely, but publicly, decisively. It worked, in a way. Friedrich the son survived, hardened, learned how to wear masks, eventually became the soldier king his father had always wanted, minus the random beatings and height obsession. But the damage? Permanent, emotional scar tissue stacked like Prussian architecture. Meanwhile, Friedrich Wilhelm I continued his reign. He reformed the military, modernized the bureaucracy, built schools, promoted literacy, laid the foundations of a state so efficient it could wage war in its sleep. But beneath it all, the madness simmered. He talked to weapons, accused carpets of sedition, once tried to replace the court orchestra with a group of military drummers and 2 angry geese. He would enter rooms shouting, then exit mid-sentence. Ministers learned not to flinch. Servants learned to disappear. His queen learned to be elsewhere. And yet, in a strange, chilling way, it all worked. The kingdom prospered. The army grew. The streets were clean, the books balanced, the trains metaphorically on time. Literal trains hadn't been invented yet, but he would have invented them out of sheer disapproval if given another decade. He died in 1740 of natural causes, in his sleep, in a bed he once accused of sleeping incorrectly. At his funeral, the soldiers marched perfectly. The streets were silent, the court wore black, the tall regiment stood tallest, and behind it all, his legacy loomed, not as a madman in the usual sense, not theatrical, not tragic, but methodical, instrumental, a man who built a state like a machine, then forced everyone inside, even if it broke them. He wasn't mad because he saw visions. He was mad because he didn't. He saw people as problems, systems, formations, and when they didn't align, he didn't weep. He corrected, ruthlessly. And so we end, not with a scream or a sob, but with a salute. A kingdom marching in step behind a man who mistook rigidity for order, cruelty for strength, and height for greatness. Friedrich Wilhelm I, the drill sergeant king, mad not in mind, but in method. And that, dear listeners, may be the most dangerous kind of madness of all. And now we descend into the depths of velvet-lined dysfunction one final time. You've made it through haunted castles, echoing ballrooms, and royal bedrooms occupied by heart-shaped urns and whispering shadows. But before we dim the last candle, there's one more monarch to meet. One more soul who wore the crown like a crown-shaped migraine. Let us now turn our gaze to Spain, specifically Charles II. Now, Charles wasn't just any king. He was, according to several very nervous ambassadors, the most unfortunate mixture of royal blood ever arranged. You see, by the time Charles was born in 1661, The Habsburg family tree looked less like a majestic oak and more like a shrub trying to fold in on itself. Generations of intermarriage had taken their toll, and Charles was the toll collector. He was born weak, small, and very much not ready to rule anything more complicated than a paper crown. His jaw didn't align, his tongue barely fit in his mouth. He couldn't chew solid food until adolescence, and even then, he preferred not to. His forehead entered a room several seconds before the rest of him. But that's not mockery, that's context. Because Charles II didn't just appear unwell, he was unwell, permanently, chronically, tragically, and no one knew what to do with him. The Spanish court, in its infinite wisdom, decided the best course of action was to surround him with religious relics, silence, and an aggressive refusal to discuss reality. He was prayed over, constantly, exercised, repeatedly, once taken to a crypt to absorb strength from the bones of saints. No one gave him an education, or hobbies, or sunlight. They gave him incense and whispered instructions like sit still and try not to drool on the treaty. He became king at age 4, not symbolically, officially. A 4-year-old in charge of one of Europe's largest empires. Granted, his mother was the regent, but still, the royal seal had a sippy cup. As he grew, so did the rumors. He was cursed, bewitched, possessed, possibly already dead and walking by sheer force of papal magic. In reality, Charles had a complex set of physical and mental conditions likely caused by centuries of cousin-on-cousin romance. But the court didn't want science, it wanted miracles. And so Charles became a royal experiment. He was bathed in holy water, fed rare herbs, once made to sleep with the spine of a martyred priest under his pillow for alignment purposes. Spoiler, it didn't help. He remained fragile, weak, frequently ill, and while his body failed him, his court failed harder. Powerful families used his weakness like a vending machine. Insert influence, extract appointments. Ministers came and went like waiters in a chaotic restaurant. Policies flipped faster than a drunk pancake. Charles, meanwhile, drifted through it all like a confused jellyfish in a velvet robe. He signed what he was told, smiled when prompted, once fell asleep during his own coronation anniversary, married twice. The first wife wept on their wedding night. The second wrote long letters describing him as sweet but not entirely present. Neither marriage produced children, or happiness, or anything that resembled a functioning monarchy. By the time he hit 30, Charles looked 60. His hair fell out, teeth rotted. He believed he was being poisoned by invisible enemies and once accused a chambermaid of hiding the devil in her apron. His ministers smiled nervously, nodded encouragingly, and quietly began making backup plans. Because here's the thing, Charles had no heir. And Spain, bless its colonial heart, had a lot to lose if the throne fell vacant. So Europe gathered like vultures at a very awkward picnic. France wanted influence, Austria wanted land, England wanted none of the above, but would happily sabotage everyone else. And Charles wanted a nap. He became increasingly obsessed with death, visited tombs, held seances, demanded to see the corpse of his great-grandfather for family guidance. He reportedly looked disappointed. Eventually, a doctor told him the truth, not about his health, about his destiny, that he would be the last of his line. Charles took this not with dignity, but with a full-scale existential meltdown. He stopped eating, stopped speaking, refused to change clothes. His court tiptoed around him like anxious servants around a cracked chandelier. Finally, in 1700, Charles II died, quietly, exhaustedly, surrounded by relics, candles, and a room full of people very ready to pretend they hadn't been waiting for this moment since 1683. He was 38 years old. He left behind no children, no lasting policies, no statues that weren't quietly moved into storage. Just a crumbling empire and a will that named a Bourbon prince as his heir, thus kicking off a massive European war and a series of diplomatic squabbles so intense they required entire orchestras to score them. Today, Charles II is remembered as the Bewitched, which is a polite way of saying, we don't really understand what happened, but it definitely wasn't great. But let's be clear, Charles wasn't evil or cruel or incompetent by choice. He was broken before he began. Born into a body that failed him, a court that lied to him, and a world that wanted a miracle when what it needed was a microscope. He was a ghost king, haunting a throne that was too heavy for bones so soft. And in the end, maybe that's the saddest story of all. Not the mad kings who raged, or the queens who vanished, but the boy who never got a chance. The child who inherited an empire and a curse and spent his life trying to hold them both with hands that never stopped trembling. 15 parts, 15 minds, 15 crowns placed lovingly on heads that, let's be honest, probably should have just stuck to gardening. And now we arrive at the end. Not with fireworks, not with a duel or a curse, but with a mirror, a final monarch, a last cracked reflection of power and humanity. Tonight we whisper into the life of Emperor Justin II of Byzantium. And if that name doesn't ring a bell, don't worry. By the end of this story, you'll probably never forget it. Justin was never meant to be the most famous ruler of the Eastern Roman Empire. That was his uncle, Justinian the Great, builder of Hagia Sophia, crusher of enemies, husband of the famously spicy Theodora. So when Justin II inherited the throne in 5565 AD, he also inherited one of the largest inferiority complexes in imperial history. He tried, bless him. He really did. He kept the robes pressed, held the Senate meetings, made speeches with lots of henceforths and thuslies. But the cracks started early. He reversed his uncle's policies, not thoughtfully, but as if swiping left on history. He refused to pay the usual tributes to the Lombards and the Persians. Why give money when you can give attitude, seemed to be the motto. It worked, for exactly 5 minutes. Then the borders caught fire. Enemies attacked, allies bailed. The treasury coughed politely and suggested maybe don't build that 6th golden fountain this month. Justin responded by yelling, a lot. Historians say he grew irritable, which is textbook for he screamed at maps. He began pacing endlessly, in full regalia, through marble halls that echoed every frustrated sandal slap. Then came the teeth. He started biting. Furniture, curtains, once allegedly a visiting ambassador, not in a political way, in a why does the emperor have wood splinters in his mouth kind of way. The court noticed, hard not to. They whispered, they worried. They tried essential oils and more prayer. But Justin kept unraveling. He began hearing things. Voices, not divine ones. Just the usual chorus of, they're watching you, and that statue blinked. He shouted at paintings, banished shadows. Once ordered the moon to leave Constantinople for being too smug. By year 6, the court had stopped pretending. This was no longer eccentricity. This was full symphonic breakdown, with timpani. They appointed his wife, Empress Sophia, as co-regent. She handled state affairs, he handled screaming at wallpaper. But the real descent, the one that sealed his place in the annals of royal unraveling, was what happened next. Because Justin II, in a moment of either inspiration or desperation, asked for music, soothing music, to calm the demons in his head. And when music worked, he wanted more. All the time. Constant, uninterrupted sound. He commissioned a rolling choir, literally, singers pushed on wheels, who would follow him around the palace singing soft, wordless hymns. They were called the melodoi. They were exhausted. Whenever they stopped singing, Justin would shriek, collapse, convulse, demand bloodletting or exorcism or worse, interpretive dance. The palace became a concert hall held hostage. Every hallway echoed with panicked lullabies. Even the pigeons learned to hum. Eventually, Sophia and the court decided enough. They didn't depose him. They paused him, a gentle sidelining. They placed him in a secluded chamber, gave him his choir, his food, and his walls. Then appointed Tiberius, his general and adoptive son, as Caesar. The empire carried on. Not perfectly, but steadily. Justin, meanwhile, continued his musical madness. One day, the singing stopped. No one knows why. Maybe the singers fainted, maybe the emperor finally ran out of songs, but for the first time in years, there was silence. And in that silence, Justin reportedly spoke one clear sentence, I am not emperor anymore. Then he wept, and died shortly after, just like that. No war, no poison, just music, madness, and one last moment of lucidity. Today, Justin II is a footnote in the grand narrative of Byzantium, overshadowed by generals and architects and walls that stood longer than empires, but maybe he deserves more, because his story wasn't about conquest, It was about collapse, about what happens when the mind of a man tasked with holding an empire finally lets go. He was born into a throne shaped like pressure, raised to think strength meant silence, that leadership meant never trembling, that to be emperor was to be marble. So when the tremors came, he bit down, literally. And when the pain became unbearable, he reached for music. And that isn't weakness. That's a man trying to build a bridge back to himself, even if it had to be made of harmonies. So tonight, as you turn off the lights, as the room softens, as the fan hums in the background, think of Justin, alone in his palace, drifting in and out of reality, clutching at melody like a lifeline. A ruler, a madman, a broken man humming to himself in a world that stopped listening, and perhaps, just perhaps, finally heard him. Too late. By now, you know the rhythm. Crown, crisis, collapse, repeat. From palaces stuffed with ghosts to royal bedrooms echoing with muttered threats to furniture, we've seen the many ways a mind can buckle under the weight of velvet and expectation. But tonight, the tale shifts west, to Portugal, to a woman who was never meant to rule, never trained to lead, and certainly never asked whether she wanted the burden she was handed. Tonight, we meet Queen Maria of Portugal. And this is the story of a mind undone not by madness alone, but by grief so vast even the throne couldn't anchor her. Maria was born into privilege, yes, but not peace. The daughter of King Jose I, she was raised in a deeply religious, emotionally stifling court. Her education, Latin, theology, dynastic politics, and how to hold back tears without wrinkling lace. She married young, to her uncle. Yes, her uncle. Because royal genetics have never been known for their creativity or restraint. Despite the family tree folding back in on itself like a cursed napkin, the couple seemed genuinely affectionate. They had several children. Maria was devout, disciplined, and determined to rule with kindness when her time came. In 1777, that time arrived. Her father died. Maria I became the first queen regnant of Portugal, a monarch in her own right, not just a consort with good handwriting. She began her reign with reform, dismissing the hated Marquis of Pombal, a man who ruled like Machiavelli with a powdered wig. Maria reversed his policies, freed political prisoners, restored rights to religious orders. She was hailed as a moral ruler, a queen with a conscience, a monarch who wept during executions and preferred prayer to pomp. But beneath the hymns and holy relics, a storm was building. First, her husband, also her uncle, died, then her eldest son, then her confessor, then her second son. One by one, the people Maria relied on, the people who had anchored her to the world, disappeared. Each loss chipped at her. Each funeral left her more fragile. She withdrew from court, prayed constantly, slept little. Doctors called it melancholy. Priests called it a trial from God. Modern psychologists would call it prolonged, untreated trauma wrapped in royal decorum. Then came the screaming. At first, whispers. She weeps in the night. She talks to herself. Then, louder. Servants heard sobbing through the palace walls, sometimes laughter, sometimes both at once. One night, she burst into a state council meeting, barefoot, in her nightgown, insisting the walls were bleating Latin prayers. She was escorted out, politely, quickly, but everyone knew. The queen was unraveling. Her youngest son, João, was forced to step in as Prince Regent. Maria remained queen in name, but her days were spent wandering candlelit corridors, clutching rosary beads and muttering to saints no one else could see. She refused visitors, refused doctors, once tried to exorcise her own shadow. She claimed it was stealing her thoughts. By 1792, her condition was undeniable. The court moved her to Queluz Palace, elegant, distant, and filled with carefully curated silence. She lived there for years, sometimes calm, sometimes screaming. Once demanded the furniture be rebaptized, the chairs were obligingly sprinkled with holy water, the rugs declined comment. But history wasn't done with her. In 1807, Napoleon invaded. The royal family fled to Brazil. Yes, Brazil, because sometimes colonialism comes with beachfront property. Maria was carried aboard the ship, wrapped in black, still muttering, still queen. She lived in Rio de Janeiro for the rest of her days, a ghost of sovereignty. A monarch by title only, she was hidden from public view, protected, preserved, almost embalmed in routine. And yet, Even in her madness, Maria remained beloved, not feared, not hated, because her pain was never cruel, never capricious. She did not lash out, she turned inward, became a monument to sorrow. And the people, perhaps seeing their own grief reflected back, softened toward her. She died in 1816, peacefully, quietly, still queen. Her body was returned to Portugal and buried in grandeur beneath marble and myths. But the real memorial is in the silence she left behind, in the corridors that no longer echoed, in the palace that finally exhaled. Today, Queen Maria I is often remembered as Maria the Mad, but that's not the truth. The truth is, she was Maria the Broken, Maria the Bereaved, Maria the Overwhelmed, a woman given too much power, too much loss, and not enough room to grieve. She wasn't a tyrant, wasn't a fool. She was human, crushed beneath the crown that promised divine right, but delivered human ruin. So as you lay down tonight, as the light fades, as the fan hums, remember Queen Maria, not for her madness, but for her mourning. Not for the throne she held, but for the heart it couldn't protect. And here we are, 17 parts deep. You've survived kings with choirs on wheels, queens who slept beside embalmed hearts, and emperors who tried to punch the moon. You've seen every flavor of royal meltdown, the operatic, the silent, the architectural. But tonight, the curtain lifts on something different, a finale with no palace, no jeweled crown, just a throne carved out of superstition and salt. Tonight, we visit Africa and we meet King Zog of Albania. Yes, Albania. Let's be honest, when people list iconic monarchs, Albania doesn't usually pop up between Louis XIV and Cleopatra. But King Zog deserves a seat. Not because he was wise, or glorious, or even particularly competent, but because he took madness and turned it into a lifestyle brand. Let's rewind. Born Ahmet Zogu in 1895, he came from a noble Albanian family with a lot of goats and a surprisingly well-funded ambition. He rose fast, became prime minister in 1922, then president. Then in 1928, because Albania was clearly not paying attention, he crowned himself king. Literally, he declared Albania a kingdom, gave himself a crown, then threw a coronation so absurdly grand for a country that had only one paved road. It might as well have been a TikTok filter titled Delusion with Diamonds. He renamed himself King Zog Was, because when you're already fabricating royalty, why not add Roman numerals? Zog ruled like a man with a checklist from a fairy tale, but none of the footnotes. He outlawed blood feuds, modernized laws, built roads, and tried to turn a mostly illiterate tribal nation into a functioning monarchy with a royal court that had all the ceremony of a badly rehearsed school play. He drank 20 cups of coffee a day, smoked 200 cigarettes, carried a golden revolver, was constantly paranoid about being assassinated, which, to be fair, was statistically reasonable. There were at least 55 recorded attempts on his life. He survived all of them. Once even drew his pistol during an ambush and returned fire in full royal regalia. King Zog, monarch, legislator, part-time action hero. He surrounded himself with bodyguards, thousands, not soldiers. Loyal mountain tribesmen in full traditional garb, armed to the teeth, glaring at any foreign diplomat who blinked too fast. At palace events, guests were frisked, watched, and sometimes searched again halfway through dessert. His paranoia wasn't confined to bullets. He distrusted telephones, mirrors, windows that faced east. He moved constantly from palace to palace, often without warning, leaving ministers playing a kind of Balkan hide-and-seek to find where government would happen that week. He refused to eat food not prepared by his own mother, even as king, even at banquets. Imagine being the Queen of Italy and being offered a tin lunchbox while Zog eats yogurt with a spoon from home. Still, his madness had style. He launched a currency with his face on it, wore capes, had his sisters declared princesses by decree, even though they'd grown up in a house that mostly featured goats and passive-aggressive furniture. But here's the twist. It worked. For a while. Albania stabilized, roads were built, laws enforced, schools opened. People, however cautiously, started buying into the idea of a modern kingdom. Until 1939, when Mussolini invaded Italy, tired of Zog's stubborn independence and refusal to be a fascist puppet, sent troops. Zog didn't fight. He fled, with his family, with 300 suitcases, with as much of Albania's gold as he could legally and questionably carry. He left the country never to return. But here's the kicker. He remained king, in exile, for 23 more years. He lived in England, then Egypt, then France. He maintained a court in exile, complete with ministers, uniforms, and extremely awkward Christmas parties. He held royal audiences in hotel lobbies, gave diplomatic speeches to bored tourists, signed decrees no one read. He was a king without a kingdom, a ruler without land. But his madness, his belief in his own myth, never wavered. Even in exile, he insisted on full royal protocol. Guards at the door, hymns at dinner. Once requested a military parade through a Parisian courtyard and was politely declined by every tenant in the building. He died in 1961. In exile. Still king, technically. Still Zogwise. Buried with honors in a land that no longer believed, but politely nodded anyway. And that is what makes Zog unique. Not the paranoia, not the gunfights or the cigarette math, but the sheer commitment to the idea. He created a kingdom from smoke, ruled with swagger, fled with dignity, and still wore the crown in his dreams. He was mad, yes, but in a way that dared history to laugh. He wasn't a fool or a tyrant. He was a believer. And in the end, maybe that's the final flavor of royal madness. Not rage, not sorrow, but delusion with discipline. Zog dreamed himself king and refused to wake up. So as the series closes, as the lights dim, as your eyes get heavy, remember this: some kings screamed, some wept, some disappeared. But Zog lit a cigarette, adjusted his crown, and declared, "This is still my throne, even if it fits in a suitcase." So, this is it. 18 parts, 18 monarchs, 18 minds stretched, splintered, shattered, or silently unspooled beneath the unbearable weight of rule. And you might think after all that we'd run out of crowns to crack, but no. Tonight, for our final descent, we return to France, and we meet the man who wore powdered wigs like armor, spent millions on hallways, and micromanaged sunrise. Yes, we end with the Sun King himself, Louis XIV. Now, wait. Before you say, wasn't he the fancy one with the ballet and the gardens and the decorative fountains shaped like gossip? Yes, that's him. But that's not all he was. Because behind the marble, beneath the brocade, inside the gilded performance, was a man consumed not by chaos, but by control. And that, my friend, is its own flavor of madness. Louis became king in 1643, at age 4. Which means his childhood was less about finger painting and more about watching advisors argue over taxes while trying not to spill his juice on the national debt. His mother ruled as regent. His godfather, Cardinal Mazarin, ran the country. And little Louis learned to perform, smile, pose, appear serene while riots broke out in the streets because nobles didn't like being taxed for their 7th castle. The trauma stuck. Because when Mazarin died in 1661, Louis didn't just take the throne, he devoured it. He ruled alone. No prime minister, no sharing, no input unless specifically requested, rehearsed, and formatted in triplicate. He declared himself "L'État c'est moi," I am the state, which historically speaking is French for I'm about to make everything about me. And he did. He didn't build a palace, he built Versailles. A monument to monarchy the size of a town and the subtlety of a diamond-encrusted peacock on stilts. Every inch of Versailles was designed to remind you, this man is king. He controlled everything. Who could approach him, when they could speak, how they should bow. Even the ceremony of waking up, the lever was a royal event where courtiers watched him open his eyes like it was opening night on Broadway. He chose when the sun rose, because he was the sun. But here's where it tilts. Because Louis wasn't just dramatic, he was afraid. Afraid of rebellion, afraid of betrayal, afraid that if he wasn't seen, he'd be forgotten, and if he was forgotten, he'd fall. So he made visibility into religion. He lived on stage. Every gesture choreographed, every word a script. Even his meals were performances. The king's table was set in full view of the court, where he would delicately chew roasted swan while people watched and pretended they weren't hungry. And the court, they played along, because that's how you survived. You flattered, fawned. Okay, pretended that watching someone put on silk stockings for 20 minutes was the highlight of your diplomatic career. But inside, the machine was creaking. Louis worked constantly. Slept little, micromanaged foreign policy, architecture, ballet choreography, and the placement of statues and fountains shaped like metaphors. He banned Protestantism, waged wars, built armies, drained treasuries, and all the while he aged. Painfully, spectacularly. By the end, his legs were swollen, his teeth rotted, his body was failing, and no one was allowed to mention it. He wore layers of makeup, perfume, and pride. He lost children, grandchildren. He outlived almost everyone he loved. The palace grew quiet, but still, he performed, even in death. His final words? "Why do you weep? Did you think I would live forever?" And honestly, yes, because Louis XIV had become more myth than man, a being made of sunlight and etiquette, suspended in gold leaf. But let's talk about the madness, not the theatrical kind, not the violent kind, but the performative kind. The madness of believing that if you can control every detail, script every encounter, choreograph every breath, you can escape pain, loss, loneliness, decay. That if you build a palace big enough, decorate it richly enough, people won't notice the trembling underneath. That if you shine brightly enough, the dark won't catch you, but it always does. Because control is an illusion, even when you're the king, especially then. Louis XIV died in 1715 after 72 years on the throne, the longest reign in European history. The sun set, Versailles fell silent, and the court, after decades of tiptoeing, finally exhaled. His great-grandson inherited a kingdom exhausted, in debt, and shimmering with unresolved trauma. But Louis left behind more than debt and fountains. He left a legacy of spectacle, a blueprint for power as performance, and a cautionary tale for every ruler who ever tried to outshine their shadow. Because in the end, Louis wasn't mad because he raged, or wept, or lost control. He was mad because he never let go, because he spent a lifetime pretending to be eternal and forgot how to be human. So tonight, as the last note fades, as the curtain drops, as your room grows still, remember Louis, not just the king, but the man who tried to hold the sun in his hands and burned. Softly, beautifully. Inevitably, you've come far. 18 stories of broken crowns and fractured minds, of palaces that echo not with laughter, but with the sound of one too many prayers whispered too late. So for this part number 19, we don't go bigger, we go smaller, to a lonely fortress on a rocky island, to a prince who never became king, and to a madness that bloomed, not in war or politics, but in silence. Tonight, we whisper about Prince Dipendra of Nepal. And this one's different. Because it didn't happen in some long-gone empire with powdered wigs and ceremonial screaming. It happened in 2001. The internet already existed. So did Game Boys. But monarchy? Still here. Still fragile. And in Nepal? Still sacred. Prince Dipendra was born in 1971. Educated in Nepal, then in England, he was smart, disciplined, fluent in English, Nepali, and court etiquette. He was a crown prince with modern polish. Photos showed him in suits, uniforms, or carefully traditional garb, always staring into the lens like a man already halfway into his destiny. Everyone expected great things, popular, photogenic, the future. But behind the ceremonial smiles was pressure, unspoken but enormous. His family was royalty in the most ancient sense, semi-divine, untouchable, expected to rule not just a country but a belief system. And Dipendra, he wanted different things. He wanted to marry Devyani Rana, a beautiful, educated woman from another noble family, but not the one the court approved. The royal family said no, repeatedly. They had other plans, other alliances. In public, Dipendra nodded. In private, he seethed. Years passed. Tensions simmered, and then, on the night of June 1st, 2001, it exploded. Literally. In the royal palace during a family gathering. The details are still debated, but the broad strokes, horrifyingly clear. Dipendra allegedly walked into the palace banquet dressed in military uniform. He was drunk, possibly drugged. He carried multiple weapons, and within minutes he opened fire on his father, King Birendra, his mother, Queen Aishwarya, his brother, sister, cousins, aunts, uncles. A massacre. A royal family reduced to silence in the span of a few heartbeats. 10 dead, dozens wounded, and then Dipendra turned the gun on himself. He didn't die immediately. He lingered, unconscious, hooked up to machines. And here comes the cruelest twist of fate. For 3 days, he was king, in a coma, a sovereign by law but not by thought. Nepal had a monarch who couldn't speak, couldn't move, and had, by all accounts, killed the court. Newspapers called it the darkest moment in the nation's history. And history blinked. Because how do you process this? A prince raised to embody virtue turns into a headline, a palace becomes a crime scene, and a crown becomes a joke. Dipendra died on June 4th. Never woke up, never spoke, was cremated quickly, quietly. The throne passed to his uncle. The people mourned. Some believed it, others didn't. Conspiracy theories bloomed like funeral flowers. It was a setup, a cover-up. He was innocent. He was a scapegoat. Even now, over 2 decades later, no one agrees. No one can. Because the idea that the future king of Nepal snapped and slaughtered his family is too unbearable to sit with for long. So it floats, like ash in the Himalayan air. But let's pause here, step back, and ask, was he mad, or was he crushed? Because this wasn't the madness of ghosts or prophecy. It wasn't centuries of cousin marriage or hallucinated saints. This was pressure, cultural, familial, personal. A man told from birth to carry a nation on his back, only to find the nation wanted him to do it their way. Not his, not with the woman he loved, not with the life he wanted. And in the end, that pressure detonated in the most violent, heartbreaking way imaginable. So no, this isn't a story with punchlines. There's no powdered wig to mock, no chamber orchestra of doom, just grief and silence and a shattered mirror of what monarchy was supposed to be. Nepal would later abolish the monarchy altogether. In 2008, the kingdom became a republic. No more crowns, no more kings, just memories of what happened, of what might have been, of a prince raised to be perfect and destroyed by the weight of that expectation. So tonight, as we near the end, as the room grows still and the stories settle into silence, spare a thought for Dipendra, not the killer, not the prince, but the man. Somewhere inside the golden ceremony, the prayers and protocol, the duty and denial, was a human being who cracked alone, utterly alone, in the most public way imaginable, and left behind a country that would never be the same. 20 stories, 20 crowns. We've seen kings who screamed at statues, queens who slept with coffins, emperors who declared war on mirrors, and one poor man who genuinely thought flutes were a form of governance. But tonight, we end not with madness, not even with royalty, but with the idea of monarchy itself, and how sometimes the madness isn't in the crown or the bloodline or the ballroom, but in the belief. The quiet, collective illusion that anyone can be born to rule. So for our final act, we turn to the Habsburgs. Yes, them again, because no series about royal fragility could ever be complete without the family who thought genetics was a snow globe you should shake every generation just to see what fell out. But this isn't about Charles II or Maria the Mournful. This is about the last one, the final Habsburg to sit on the imperial throne. Enter Charles I of Austria. Born in 1887, when steam-powered empires and war was still considered a polite disagreement with sabers, he was never meant to rule. There were cousins and uncles, and Franz Ferdinand, whose name now mostly reminds people of a band and a bullet. But history doesn't ask permission. It just elbows everyone out of the way until you're sitting on a throne with a crown that weighs more than your understanding of geopolitics. In 1916, in the middle of World War I, Charles first became Emperor of Austria and King of Hungary. Imagine being handed a smoking empire with half its limbs already blown off and being told, fix it and wear this shiny hat while you do. Charles tried, really. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't clueless. Just completely, tragically overwhelmed. He attempted peace negotiations, secretly wrote letters to the Allies, proposed reform, tried to be the monarch of a new century, one with democracy and compromise and fewer powdered uniforms. Everyone ignored him, or laughed, or whispered because it was too late. The empire was rotting from within. Nationalism was rising, and Vienna had become less capital, more pressure cooker. Then, 1918, the war ends, and with it, the empire. Charles doesn't abdicate. He suspends participation in government, which is like being fired and saying, I'm just taking a long lunch. He retreats to Switzerland, still calls himself emperor, still signs letters as His Imperial Majesty, still insists to anyone who will listen that the monarchy can be restored. And Then, because history loves a second act, he tries. Twice. In 1921, Charles attempts to reclaim the throne of Hungary, not with an army, with hope. He arrives, makes speeches, Hungarian politicians smile nervously, then politely ask him to go away. He tries again, same year, even gets within marching distance of Budapest. But the government panics, the Allies panic. Everyone starts waving treaties and yelling in multiple languages. Charles is arrested, again, exiled, this time to Madeira. Not the paradise part, the rainy, windswept, slightly moldy part. He lives in a borrowed villa, no staff, no court, no crown. He writes letters, sends telegrams, holds imaginary meetings with invisible ministers. Still signs everything Emperor of Austria, still believes, but belief doesn't pay rent or feed children. The money runs out, the food runs thin, the villa goes cold. Charles catches pneumonia, refuses treatment, says he must suffer in solidarity with my people. He dies in 1922 at 34, in exile, uncrowned, unmourned, but never unconvinced. He was buried in Madeira, his heart later placed in Switzerland, because nothing says monarchy like scattering your organs across international borders. Today, Charles I is remembered by few, mentioned in footnotes, occasionally beatified by the church for his pacifism, but mostly forgotten, the last emperor of a crumbling idea. And maybe that's what this whole series has really been about. Not insanity, not crowns, not history, but belief. The desperate, dazzling, dangerous belief that one person, birthed by blood, by divine permission slip, can hold the world together. That if the crown is polished enough, if the rituals are grand enough, if the ancestors are smug enough, then maybe chaos can be tamed. But it can't, because power isn't sacred. It's heavy, it breaks. And the ones we ask to wear it, they break too. Sometimes loudly, sometimes quietly, sometimes with a scream, sometimes with a symphony, and sometimes with a sigh. So tonight, as the stories end, as the last candle burns low, as your room falls silent, remember this. They weren't all mad, they weren't all cruel, most weren't ready, many were scared, and some were just trying to hold on to a dream, to a legacy, to the illusion that the crown meant control and not just a prettier kind of prison. Sleep well, dear listener, and may your kingdom always be optional. You didn't think we were done, did you? 20 parts and still something's missing. Some final flourish, some last crown not yet cracked. Because as much as we've whispered through Versailles and tiptoed past the ghost of Charles II's chin, we haven't yet arrived at the most absurd corner of royal history. A kingdom so surreal it feels made up. But it wasn't. Tonight, dear listener, we travel to Central Africa, to a man who loved Napoleon so much, he became him. Allow me to introduce Emperor Bokassa I of the Central African Empire. Yes, empire, not republic, not kingdom, empire. But it wasn't always so, imperially absurd. Jean Bedel Bokassa began life in 1921 in what was then French Equatorial Africa. He joined the French army, fought in Indochina, fought in Algeria, rose through the ranks with military precision and a dash of unsettling charm, then returned home, where, like any reasonable man in a post-colonial state, he decided democracy was adorable, but dictatorship was faster. In 1966, he overthrew his cousin, the president, because of course he did, and proclaimed himself president for life. Standard dictator move, but Bokassa wasn't content with president, too modest, too modern. He wanted grandeur, legacy, sequence. So in 1976, he declared the Central African Republic an empire, and crowned himself Emperor Bokassa was. At a ceremony that cost 1/3 of the national budget, let me repeat that, not 1/3 of the entertainment budget, 1/3 of everything. He imported white horses, ordered jewel-encrusted uniforms, built a golden throne shaped like a giant eagle. His coronation crown, fashioned in France, solid gold, encrusted with 2,000 diamonds, cost around $5 million. In 1976, money. For reference, the country didn't have consistent electricity, but it had a throne so shiny you could signal space shuttles with it. The coronation day, a 24-hour fever dream. He paraded in like Napoleon, complete with a velvet cape 13 feet long carried by 48 attendants. Yes, 48 to carry a cape. While citizens lined the streets, some barefoot, some starving, all blinking at the surreal spectacle of a man who had declared himself divine in a place where most roads weren't paved. But Bokassa wasn't just ridiculous. He was terrifying. He banned student protests, then had the students arrested, then allegedly had them killed in a palace dungeon. His paranoia rivaled Stalin's, his temper operatic. He once threw a minister out of a moving car because the man coughed during a meeting. He ruled with cruelty wrapped in comedy, imprisoned journalists, banned shoes he didn't like, claimed to be in direct spiritual contact with Napoleon Bonaparte, ordered medals for his pet crocodile. All real, all documented. But here's where reality finally blinked. In 1979, even France, which had cheerfully tolerated coups, dictators, and whatever that thing was in Haiti, said, okay, maybe not. Operation Barracuda was launched. French paratroopers swooped in. Bokassa was ousted while on a trip to Libya, yes, hanging out with Gaddafi because madness attracts. He fled into exile, first Ivory Coast, then France, where he lived in a modest chateau. Still claiming to be emperor, still wearing robes, still sending letters to international leaders demanding they recognize his divine right. Nobody did. Eventually, Bokassa returned to Central Africa, was arrested, tried, sentenced to death. Then, because history never just ends normally, his sentence was commuted. Then reduced again. Then he was released. He died in 1996, peacefully, at home, still convinced he had been a misunderstood genius, still referring to himself as emperor, still surrounded by portraits of himself, often shirtless, sometimes with angel wings. Today, the Central African Empire is gone. The Golden Throne is gathering dust somewhere. The diamonds disappeared, the roads are still rough, and Bokassa, he lingers. A punchline, a warning, a fever dream in velvet, but also a final testament to the delusion of monarchy. Because Bokassa wasn't born royal, he didn't inherit power. He built it from uniforms, from myths, from his own reflection. He turned himself into a monarch, then into a god, then into a symbol so bloated with ego it collapsed under its own absurdity. So tonight, as we drift towards sleep, as the stories soften, as the madness fades into myth, remember Bokassa, not just the tyrant, not just the clown, but the man who wanted so badly to be remembered. He created an empire out of nothing, a man who built a crown out of costume jewelry and belief. And for a brief, surreal moment, it worked until it didn't. You've made it this far, through velvet-draped breakdowns, powdered wigs of despair, and palaces echoing with royal regrets. But let's not close the curtain just yet, because there's one more door we haven't opened. And behind it, not just madness, but performance art. Tonight, dear listener, we travel to ancient Rome, to the man, the myth, the musical menace, Emperor Nero. Now, before you roll your eyes and mutter, oh yeah, the guy who fiddled while Rome burned, let's clarify, he didn't fiddle. Fiddles weren't invented yet. But he did, allegedly, stand on a rooftop in full theatrical costume and sing about the destruction of Troy while his city turned into barbecue. So, points for commitment. Nero was born in 37 AD, the great-nephew of Emperor Claudius. He became emperor at 17. Which, as we've learned from this series, is just about the worst possible age to hand someone the keys to an empire. At first, he did okay. His mother, Agrippina, basically ran the empire behind him. She was sharp, ambitious, extremely fond of poison. She also may have murdered her own husband, Claudius, to put Nero on the throne. Family game night in the Julio-Claudian household must have been a hoot. But Nero, like most teen emperors with mommy issues and access to unlimited grapes, soon got tired of being a puppet. So he did what any self-respecting imperial teenager would do. He had her killed, allegedly. It took several tries. He reportedly sent her a collapsible boat that would accidentally sink. She swam back to shore. He tried poison. She didn't die. Eventually, someone just stabbed her. When told she was finally dead, Nero allegedly said she deserved it, then wrote a poem about it, as one does. This, in hindsight, was a red flag, because Nero didn't just want to rule. He wanted to be loved, adored, applauded on stage. He fancied himself a poet, a playwright, a singer, a chariot racer, a living god. He once held a singing competition where no one was allowed to leave, even for childbirth, until he finished performing. Spoiler, he took hours. His performances were mandatory. He would recite epic poetry while the Senate nodded like terrified groupies. He staged enormous festivals where he'd act out mythological deaths while real prisoners were murdered as special effects. At one point, he declared himself Apollo reborn. And the scary part? He believed it. But Rome was not impressed. They wanted stability, not nightly recitations of self-written ballads titled Ode to My Own Greatness. And then in 64 AD came the fire. A massive inferno consumed the city. For 6 days, Rome burned, people died, homes vanished, and Nero stood on a rooftop, in costume, singing. Now maybe he didn't start the fire, maybe he didn't laugh maniacally while roasting marshmallows, but when your city is on fire, and your emperor is hosting an interpretive musical about mythological flames, optics are bad. Public opinion turned fast. To deflect blame, Nero pointed at the Christians, persecuted them, burned them alive, used their bodies as torches for garden parties. Yes, that happened. All while continuing his public performances and architectural fantasies. He ordered a new palace, Domus Aurea, the Golden House, complete with revolving dining rooms, fountains of perfume, and walls that literally sparkled. Rome was starving. Nero was designing a rotating ceiling mural. By 68 AD, it all came crashing down. The army revolted, the Senate turned. Nero fled, alone, afraid. With no choir to narrate the moment, he hid in a villa, tried to kill himself, failed. Eventually, with soldiers approaching, he asked a servant to help him finish the job. His final words, "What an artist dies in me." Not what a leader. Not what a legacy. An artist. That's Nero, in one tragic flaming tunic-clad nutshell. So was he mad? Yes, but not in the frothing, ghost-chasing, sword-waving way. Nero's madness was theatrical, delusional, performative. He didn't see himself as emperor, he saw himself as the star. Rome was just his stage. The people, an audience. And when they booed, he burned the theater down. But under all the glitter and cruelty was a child, a boy who never knew love without fear, who killed the mother who made him emperor, who ruled with insecurity wrapped in silk, who stood on a burning rooftop and sang because that was the only way he knew how to matter. So tonight, as your room quiets, as the world softens, remember Nero, not for the flames, but for the silence underneath, for the boy emperor in golden slippers, trying to be seen, trying to be loved, even as the empire crumbled beneath his feet. By now, you've heard nearly every note in the royal symphony of unraveling, the shrill high of paranoia, the tragic minor key of exile, the awkward rhythm of cousin marriage-induced collapse. But just when you think the concert's over, another instrument plays. And this one, it's not a violin, it's a marching drum. Because tonight, we go to Prussia, to a king who didn't lose his mind in tragedy or poetry or palace intrigue, but in perfection. And that's where it gets dangerous. Say Guten Abend to Frederick William Fürst of Prussia, also known as the Soldier King, also known as the guy who turned his country into a boot camp and accidentally scared his son into becoming a flute-playing philosopher. Frederick William ruled from 1713 to 1740. And if you're imagining powdered wigs and tea parties, please stop. Now, because this was not that kind of royal. Frederick William hated luxury. He wore military uniforms 24/7. He banned lace, once publicly whipped a courtier for wearing perfume. His idea of a good time? Inspections, military drills, inventory management. He didn't want paintings. He wanted accounting reports. And above all, he wanted one thing: tall soldiers. Yes, you read that right. Frederick William had an obsession with giant men. He created the Potsdam Giants, a special regiment composed only of soldiers over 6'2". If you were tall and alive in 18th century Europe, there was a non-zero chance Prussian agents were trying to kidnap you. Seriously, he paid parents for tall babies, tried to breed height into families like some kind of human thoroughbred program. Once received a painting of a tall man and promoted the painting. His obsession was so absurd, even other monarchs mocked him, while quietly measuring their guards. But the madness wasn't in his efficiency. It was in how total it became. He turned Prussia into a military machine. Every school taught obedience. Every citizen knew inspection could happen anywhere. He'd randomly appear in towns to check uniforms, hygiene, and how efficiently people bowed. once slapped a woman in public for smiling too slowly. He personally beat officers who displeased him with a cane. In public, he was a one-man HR department with rage issues and very little sleep. But here's the thing, it worked. Sort of. He doubled the size of the army, tripled the efficiency of government, left the treasury overflowing, but also he left behind trauma that echoed like marching boots down the spine of a nation, especially in his own family, because Frederick William had a son, a very delicate, thoughtful, music-loving son. His name, Frederick, later known as Frederick the Great. But in his father's eyes, just a disappointment. Frederick William wanted a warrior. He got a poet. He wanted a drill sergeant. He got a kid who played flute under trees and wrote love letters in French. Their relationship was horrific. Frederick William routinely beat his son in public, in front of servants. At one point, he smashed a violin over the boy's head. Frederick tried to escape, tried to flee Prussia with a friend. They were caught. And here comes the darkest chapter. The friend, young, naive, complicit in treason, was executed. Right in front of Frederick, on his father's orders. Because nothing says healthy parenting like a royal snuff film. Frederick broke, silently, internally. But he learned. He learned how power works, how performance protects, how to nod just right. He became what his father wanted, at least on the surface. But the damage? Permanent. Frederick William ruled until 1740, died with a kingdom stronger than ever, and a son who would become one of the greatest rulers in European history. But here's the haunting part. Frederick the Great never married, rarely smiled, led brilliant wars, built beautiful palaces, but never quite escaped the sound of boots or the memory of his friend's blood in the grass. Because when your madness is efficiency, when you train a nation like a weapon, the cut doesn't always bleed right away. Sometimes it just keeps echoing. So was Frederick William mad? Not in the classical sense, not in the Nero sense, but in the way control becomes obsession. And obsession becomes identity, and identity becomes a cage. So tonight, as your room falls quiet and the world fades, remember the Soldier King, not just for his cane or his giants or his spreadsheet soul, but for the boy he broke and the kingdom that mistook discipline for peace. You've made it this far, through velvet-draped breakdowns, powdered wigs of despair, and palaces echoing with royal regrets. But let's not close the curtain just yet, because there's one more door we haven't opened, and behind it, not just madness, but performance art. Tonight, dear listener, we travel to ancient Rome, to the man, the myth, the musical menace, Emperor Nero. Now, before you roll your eyes and mutter, "Oh yeah, the guy who fiddled while Rome burned," let's clarify. He didn't fiddle. Fiddles weren't invented yet. But he did, allegedly, stand on a rooftop in full theatrical costume and sing about the destruction of Troy while his city turned into barbecue. So, points for commitment. Nero was born in 37 AD, the great-nephew of Emperor Claudius. He became emperor at 17, which, as we've learned from this series, is just about the worst possible age to hand someone the keys to an empire. At first, he did okay. His mother, Agrippina, basically ran the empire behind him. She was sharp, ambitious, extremely fond of poison. She also may have murdered her own husband, Claudius, to put Nero on the throne. Family game night in the Julio-Claudian household must have been a hoot. But Nero, like most teen emperors with mommy issues and access to unlimited grapes, soon got tired of being a puppet. So he did what any self-respecting imperial teenager would do. He had her killed, allegedly. It took several tries. He reportedly sent her a collapsible boat that would accidentally sink. She swam back to shore. He tried poison. She didn't die. Eventually, someone just stabbed her. When told she was finally dead, Nero allegedly said she deserved it, then wrote a poem about it, as one does. This, in hindsight, was a red flag, because Nero didn't just want to rule. He wanted to be loved, adored, applauded, on stage. He fancied himself a poet, a playwright, a singer, a chariot racer, a living god. He once held a singing competition where no one was allowed to leave, even for childbirth, until he finished performing. Spoiler, he took hours. His performances were mandatory. He would recite epic poetry while the Senate nodded like terrified groupies. He staged enormous festivals where he'd act out mythological deaths while real prisoners were murdered as special effects. At one point, he declared himself Apollo reborn. And the scary part? He believed it. But Rome was not impressed. They wanted stability, not nightly recitations of self-written ballads titled Ode to My Own Greatness. And then in 64 AD came the fire. A massive inferno consumed the city. For 6 days, Rome burned, people died, homes vanished, and Nero stood on a rooftop in costume, singing. Now, maybe he didn't start the fire, maybe he didn't laugh maniacally while roasting marshmallows, but when your city is on fire and your emperor is hosting an interpretive musical about mythological flames, optics are bad. Public opinion turned fast. To deflect blame, Nero pointed at the Christians, persecuted them, burned them alive, used their bodies as torches for garden parties. Yes, that happened, all while continuing his public performances and architectural fantasies. He ordered a new palace, Domus Aurea, the Golden House, complete with revolving dining rooms, fountains of perfume, and walls that literally sparkled. Rome was starving. Nero was designing a rotating ceiling mural. By 68 AD, it all came crashing down. The army revolted, the Senate turned, Nero fled, alone, afraid, with no choir to narrate the moment. He hid in a villa, tried to kill himself, failed. Eventually, with soldiers approaching, he asked a servant to help him finish the job. His final words? What an artist dies in me. Not what a leader, what a legacy. An artist. That's Nero, in one tragic, flaming, tunic-clad nutshell. So was he mad? Yes, but not in the frothing, ghost-chasing, sword-waving way. Nero's madness was theatrical, delusional, performative. He didn't see himself as emperor. He saw himself as the star. Rome was just his stage. The people? An audience. And when they booed, he burned the theater down. But under all the glitter and cruelty was a child. A boy who never knew love without fear, who killed the mother who made him emperor, who ruled with insecurity wrapped in silk, who stood on a burning rooftop and sang, because that was the only way he knew how to matter. So tonight, as your room quiets, as the world softens, remember Nero, not for the flames, but for the silence underneath. For the boy emperor in golden slippers trying to be seen, trying to be loved, even as the empire crumbled beneath his feet. Here we are. Part 25. You've survived royal fistfights, golden thrones that smelled like bankruptcy, and monarchs who thought they were literally made of glass. So what's left? One final curtain call, one more gilded collapse, and this time we go north to Russia, to a man who drank mercury, worshipped ghosts, and tried to outshine death with iron will and increasingly weird beards. Tonight, dear listener, we meet Tsar Ivan IV, but you know him by his stage name. Ivan the Terrible. Yes, that one, the OG Slavic nightmare. But before we start picturing blood-stained robes and wild eyes glowing in candlelight, let's rewind. Ivan was born in 1530, crowned Grand Prince of Moscow at age 3, because why not? His father died, his mother ruled as regent, until she was almost certainly poisoned. Then came the boyars, the nobles, the real power behind the throne. And Ivan watched, listened, seethed. He was mistreated, isolated, ignored, sometimes left hungry, other times taunted by nobles who saw him as a puppet with a crown. And the crown felt heavier every year. By the time he was 16, he was done playing dress-up. He demanded a coronation, a real one, crowned himself Tsar of all Russia, not Prince, not Grand Duke. Tsar, as in Caesar. He was claiming divine authority, empire-level vibes, and for a while he delivered reforms, law codes, administrative restructuring. He founded the Streltsy, Russia's first standing army, opened trade routes, centralized power. Russia started looking less like a medieval patchwork quilt and more like an actual state. But power corrodes, and Ivan's trauma never left the room. Then in 1560, his beloved wife, Anastasia, died, probably poisoned, again. And Ivan snapped, like a violin string wrapped too tight for too long. He blamed the boyars, declared war on his own government, created the Oprichnina, his personal secret police. They dressed in black, rode black horses, carried severed dog heads on their saddles, because subtlety was apparently banned in 16th century Russia. They tortured, burned villages, executed nobles, sometimes entire towns. Ivan cheered, sometimes participated, sometimes prayed afterward. then did it again. He left Moscow, then came back, then left again, built a fortress, filled it with holy relics, skulls, and court jesters who didn't survive long. He wrote letters to other monarchs that read like the diary of a very literate demon. He beat his courtiers, beat his wives, beat his son. And in 1581, during one particularly unhinged rage, he killed him. The heir, the one person who might have led Russia forward, struck him with a staff, saw the blood, collapsed in guilt. There's a painting by Ilya Repin, Ivan holding his son's body, eyes wide, mouth open, shock, grief, madness, all dripping down his face like candle wax. It's one of the most haunting images in Russian art because it's real. He never recovered. His health declined. Paranoia deepened. He turned to alchemy, mercury, strange rituals, tried to live forever. He didn't. In 1584, Ivan died while playing chess, collapsed mid-game. His body was found riddled with toxins, likely from the mercury-laced medicine he consumed daily. Because what's one more drop of poison in a life already soaked with it? So was Ivan mad? Yes, absolutely, but he wasn't born that way. He was forged in grief, neglect, betrayal. Every betrayal a spark, every spark feeding a furnace, until he mistook terror for loyalty, control for love, and history still trembles. Because Ivan didn't just break, he taught a kingdom how to bend. So as the snow falls, as your room grows quiet and the ghosts settle in, remember Ivan. Not just the terrible, but the terrified, the child who became a tyrant because no one taught him how to heal. And just like that, our royal journey comes to a close. But before you dim the lights and drift off into the warm embrace of your blanket kingdom, I'd love to hear from you. Which monarch left the biggest impression? Was it the flute-playing escape artist from Prussia, the velvet-obsessed ghost of Versailles, or perhaps Ivan, who swung a scepter and trauma in equal measure? Leave a comment below. Tell me which story stayed with you the longest, made you laugh, or made you rethink what power really means. I read every single one, and trust me, your thoughts are more valuable than any gold-plated crown. And if you've enjoyed this journey, these nightly visits to the crumbling corridors of power, then consider subscribing to the channel. It helps me keep the lights low, the history strange, and the bedtime stories just the right amount of unsettling. Thank you for being here. Sleep well, my brave time traveler, and I'll see you next time when another tale creaks open and history whispers once again.